expeditions into the Amazon basin have, over more than a century of exploration, moved through environments where mapping becomes uncertain long before understanding begins. Early survey teams followed river systems into regions where dense canopy cover erased visibility from above and ground conditions shifted faster than records could stabilize. Geological, archaeological, and biological observations accumulated in fragments, often separated by vast distances and inconsistent documentation. Within this landscape, unusual findings have repeatedly emerged in isolation, each recorded under conditions that limit verification and continuity, leaving behind a pattern of incomplete but persistent anomalies. As you move through these records, you're not encountering a single unified mystery. You're instead faced with separate events that resist explanation in different ways. They appear across structures, environments, and phenomena that do not easily align with established scientific interpretation, the Amazon's hidden geoglyphs. For centuries, the Amazon rainforest was regarded as a place that resisted permanence, a vast and shifting ecosystem where dense vegetation and fragile soil seemed to prevent the rise of complex, long-lasting civilizations. Early explorers and scientists described it as a landscape that erased human traces almost as quickly as they were made, reinforcing the belief that whatever societies existed within it must have been small, mobile, and ephemeral. Beneath the uninterrupted canopy, the ground remained largely unseen, its surface concealed by roots, shadows, and layers of organic decay that revealed little about what lay hidden below. That assumption began to fracture in the late 20th century, not through deliberate excavation, but through destruction. As sections of the rainforest in western Brazil were cleared for agriculture and development, the exposed land revealed shapes that did not belong to natural erosion or random clearing. From the air, vast geometric patterns emerged with unsettling clarity. Perfectly straight lines carved into the earth stretched across hundreds of meters, forming squares, circles, and complex interconnected designs that appeared too precise to be accidental. These formations, now known as geoglyphs, had remained hidden for centuries beneath the forest that had grown over them. The earliest documented reports of these structures began appearing in the 1970s, particularly in the state of Acre, where deforestation exposed dozens of these earthworks across previously inaccessible terrain. What initially seemed like isolated anomalies soon revealed a larger pattern as aerial surveys expanded. By the early 21st century, hundreds of geoglyphs had been identified, with more continuing to appear as additional areas were cleared. Some measured up to 300 meters in diameter, with ditches several meters deep and wide, bordered by raised embankments that suggested deliberate and sustained construction efforts. Archaeologists studying these formations quickly recognized that they were not the remnants of simple settlements or defensive structures. The precision of their geometry indicated planning and coordination on a scale that contradicted earlier assumptions about Amazonian societies. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal and organic material found within the ditches placed many of these structures between approximately 500 BCE and 1000 CE, a period during which the region was believed to support only scattered small-scale communities. The presence of such large and organised earthworks suggested not only population density, but also a level of social complexity that had long been considered unlikely in the Amazon. Yet the purpose of these geoglyphs remains uncertain. Unlike the defensive walls or urban layouts seen in other ancient civilizations, these structures do not appear to have been designed for habitation. Many lack evidence of permanent buildings within their boundaries, and their arrangement often seems symbolic rather than practical. Some researchers have proposed that they functioned as ceremonial or ritual spaces, possibly used for gatherings, processions, or spiritual activities that left little physical trace beyond the earthworks themselves. Others suggest they may have served as territorial markers, defining regions within a broader cultural landscape that has yet to be fully understood. The surrounding environment adds another layer of complexity to their existence. The Amazon soil is typically nutrient poor, making large-scale agriculture difficult without significant modification. However, in regions where geoglyphs have been found, scientists have also identified areas of terra preta, a form of anthropogenic soil enriched with charcoal, organic waste, and other materials. This artificially fertile soil indicates that the people who constructed the geoglyphs may have practiced advanced land management techniques, transforming the environment in ways that supported sustained populations. The coexistence of these soils and the earthworks suggests a level of environmental knowledge that challenges long-held views of the rainforest as an inhospitable setting for complex societies. Despite these discoveries, critical questions remain unresolved. The sheer number and distribution of geoglyphs imply a network of communities that interacted across vast distances, yet there is little evidence of the roads, settlements, or infrastructure that would typically accompany such a system. While some linear features connecting certain sites have been observed, they're inconsistent and do not form a clearly defined network. The absence of written records or identifiable cultural markers further complicates efforts to understand who built these structures and why. Satellite imaging and LIDAR technology have begun to reveal additional features beneath the forest canopy, hinting that the known geoglyphs may represent only a fraction of what once existed. These tools allow researchers to penetrate the dense vegetation without removing it, uncovering subtle variations in elevation that correspond to buried earthworks. In some cases, new formations have been identified in areas where no deforestation has occurred, suggesting that the Amazon may conceal an extensive and largely undocumented archaeological landscape. What makes the geoglyphs particularly difficult to interpret is the way they defy expectations on multiple levels. They are too large and numerous to be the product of isolated groups, yet they lack the characteristics of known urban centres. They demonstrate engineering precision, yet their function remains ambiguous. They are remnants of a society that clearly understood its environment, yet left behind no obvious narrative of its existence. Each discovery adds detail without providing clarity, expanding the scope of the mystery rather than resolving it. As more of the rainforest is surveyed, the number of known geoglyphs continues to grow, raising the possibility that entire regions once shaped by human activity have been concealed for centuries beneath the forest's regrowth. The implications extend beyond archaeology, forcing a reconsideration of how the Amazon itself has been understood, not as an untouched wilderness, but as a landscape that may have been significantly influenced by human hands long before modern observation. And as the canopy recedes in scattered fragments, it reveals just enough of what was buried to suggest that far more remains hidden beneath the forest, waiting in silence for reasons no one has yet been able to explain. The unmapped river beneath the Amazon. Beneath the vast network of winding rivers that define the Amazon basin, another system exists that does not appear on any map. The surface waters, stretching across thousands of kilometers, have long been studied as one of the most powerful and complex river systems on Earth, carrying immense volumes of fresh water from the Andes to the Atlantic Ocean. Seasonal floods reshape entire regions, sediment travels across continents, and the visible river channels dominate every understanding of how the basin functions. Yet even within this immense and carefully observed system, there have always been small inconsistencies, subtle patterns that did not fully align with what could be seen, as though part of the Amazon's movement was occurring beyond the reach of direct observation. For decades, the behaviour of the Amazon's surface waters hinted at something deeper influencing its flow. Hydrologists studying temperature distributions noticed irregularities that could not be easily explained by solar heating or atmospheric conditions alone. Certain regions retained heat in ways that suggested a transfer occurring below ground, while other measurements revealed gradients that did not match expected geological stability. These anomalies were often treated as minor deviations, absorbed into broader models without clear resolution, yet they persisted across different studies, quietly suggesting that the basin's internal dynamics extended further than surface measurements could account for. Attempts to reconcile these inconsistencies did not immediately lead to a discovery, but rather to a prolonged period of uncertainty. Researchers explored possibilities ranging from variations in sediment composition to localized geothermal influences, yet none of these explanations fully accounted for the scale or consistency of the observed data. The deeper scientists looked into the basin's thermal behavior, the more it became apparent that something was redistributing heat across vast distances underground, moving slowly but with enough continuity to leave a measurable signature. What researchers eventually identified was not a conventional river, but a slow-moving current hidden thousands of meters below ground. This realization emerged in 2011 when a group of scientists analyzing temperature data from oil exploration wells began to notice a pattern that extended across multiple regions of the Amazon basin. These wells, drilled to depths of several kilometers, provided vertical profiles of temperature that revealed how heat moved through layers of sediment and rock. Instead of remaining static, the data suggested horizontal movement of water deep underground, forming what appeared to be a continuous flow beneath the surface river. Evidence for this buried system emerged not through exploration, but through indirect measurements taken during geological studies. The temperature gradients recorded in these wells indicated that heat was being carried laterally, a process most consistent with the movement of water through porous rock formations. By comparing data from multiple drilling sites, researchers constructed a model of an extensive subterranean flow stretching across the basin, running roughly parallel to the Amazon River itself. This underground system, later referred to as the Hamza River, was not directly observed but inferred through the consistency of these thermal patterns, forming a picture of something vast yet entirely concealed. Unlike the Amazon River above it, this subterranean flow moves at a pace so gradual it challenges the very definition of a river. While the surface waters surge with visible Elkhutan speed, this underground current is estimated to travel only a few meters per year, moving through permeable geological layers rather than a defined channel. Its width, however, may span hundreds of kilometers, making it comparable in scale to the river above despite its near imperceptible motion. Existing at depths reaching up to 4,000 meters, it flows through conditions of immense pressure and complete darkness, far removed from any environment that can be directly studied. Attempts to explain its formation have led scientists into unresolved questions about the basin's geological history. The Amazon basin consists of thick sedimentary deposits accumulated over millions of years, creating layers that can store and transmit groundwater. Yet the existence of such a large and coherent flow at extreme depths raises uncertainties about how it developed and why it persists. Some researchers suggest it may result from the slow infiltration of surface water over geological timescales, gradually moving downward and across the basin. Others point to tectonic influences that may have shaped the pathways through which this water travels, though no single explanation fully accounts for its scale or continuity. Debate also surrounds whether this system should even be classified as a river. Unlike traditional rivers, which follow defined channels with observable banks and grein, the Hamza River appears to diffuse through porous rock, spreading across a wide and irregular kshetra rather than forming a single drian. Some scientists argue that it is more accurately described as a vast groundwater drian, while others maintain that its al-hajm and directional movement justify the term river. This lack of consensus reflects a deeper uncertainty about how to interpret something that does not conform to familiar definitions, existing in a space between established categories. Expanding the implications of this discovery reveals a system that may influence far more than its hidden presence suggests. If this underground flow interacts with the surface Amazon, even indirectly, it could play a role in regulating groundwater distribution, affecting soil moisture, and contributing to the basin's long-term stability. The idea that such a massive volume of water is moving beneath the rainforest challenges conventional hydrological models, suggesting that the visible river system may be only one layer of a far more complex structure. Even with modern technology, direct observation of this underground system remains out of reach, leaving much of its nature inferred rather than seen. Drilling to such depths across the Amazon basin presents immense logistical challenges, and the diffuse nature of the flow makes it difficult to isolate or measure directly. As a result, scientists rely on indirect evidence, piecing together its existence through temperature data, geological modelling, and the consistency of patterns observed across vast distances. What has been identified is not a fully mapped system, but a presence defined by evidence that points to something real, yet not fully understood. Far below the rainforest, beyond the reach of light and direct exploration, a vast current continues to move through the earth in a silence that remains almost entirely unknown. The boiling river of Shanai Timpishka. A faint shimmer rises from the surface of a quiet river deep within the Amazon rainforest. The surrounding vegetation appears unchanged, dense and humid as it is throughout much of the region, yet the air above the water carries a subtle distortion, as though heat is escaping from something unseen. There is no visible turbulence, no violent movement to suggest instability, only a steady current passing through the forest while releasing warmth into an environment already defined by heat. At first glance, it does not appear extraordinary, but the longer it is observed, the more the atmosphere around it begins to feel out of place. Only upon approaching the water does the true nature of the boiling river of Shanai Timpishka begin to reveal itself. The Sharat rising from its surface is not a byproduct of climate alone, but something generated from within the river itself. Measurements taken at various points along its course have recorded temperatures reaching up to around 86 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cause severe burns within seconds. In certain areas, the water appears to bubble lightly, releasing steam into the surrounding Lhoa, while fallen leaves and small branches drift along the current, slowly breaking down in conditions that resemble controlled boiling rather than natural river flow. Located in the Peruvian Amazon, the boiling river of Shanai Timpishka stretches for approximately 6 kilometers through dense forest, with its most intense harat concentrated along specific segments. Its width varies, in some places spanning over 20 meters, while its depth can exceed several meters, creating a substantial body of water rather than an isolated thermal feature. What distinguishes this river from other geothermal phenomena is not only its temperature, but its scale and continuity, existing as a flowing system rather than a localized hot spring. The surrounding landscape offers no immediate explanation, as there are no active volcanoes in the vicinity capable of supplying such sustained heat. Long before scientists attempted to measure it, indigenous communities living nearby were already familiar with the river's unusual nature. Known locally as Shanai Timpishka, a name often translated as boiled with the heat of the sun, the river has been part of oral tradition for generations. These accounts describe its hararat as something to be respected rather than questioned, a natural feature integrated into cultural understanding rather than isolated as an anomaly. The presence of the river was never hidden, yet its behaviour was accepted without the need for scientific classification, existing within a framework of knowledge that did not require external validation. Modern scientific attention toward the boiling river of Shanai Timpishka began with efforts to document and understand its extreme temperatures. Geoscientist Andres Russo conducted field studies that confirmed the river's hararat through direct measurement, mapping temperature variations along its length, and collecting data to determine its origin. His findings verified that the river consistently reached near boiling conditions, a result that immediately challenged conventional geological expectations. Unlike geothermal systems associated with volcanic regions, the boiling river exists in an area where such intense heat should not naturally occur. What makes this river especially difficult to explain is the absence of a nearby volcanic heat source. In most known cases, water reaches high temperatures due to proximity to magma or geothermal inertia associated with tectonic activity. The Amazon basin, however, is geologically stable in comparison to volcanic regions, lacking the conditions typically required to generate sustained hararat of this magnitude. The presence of the boiling river of Shanai Timpishka within this environment introduces a contradiction that current models struggle to resolve, as the known mechanisms of geothermal heating do not fully apply. Several theories have been proposed to account for the river's hararat, yet none fully resolve the contradiction it presents. One explanation suggests that rainwater seeps deep into the Alard, where it is heated by geothermal gradients before rising back to the surface through fault lines. While this process can produce hot springs, scaling it to explain a river of this size and temperature remains problematic. The consistency of the heat, combined with the river's length and flow, implies a system more extensive than isolated pockets of heated water. Other interpretations consider the possibility of deeper geological structures channeling heat upward, though evidence for such formations remains limited and inconclusive. Despite continued study, the boiling river of Shanai Timpishka remains an active and persistent phenomenon. It continues to flow through the rainforest, maintaining its hararat across changing seasons and environmental conditions. The surrounding ecosystem adapts to its presence, with vegetation growing along its banks while avoiding direct contact with the water. Animals approach cautiously, and in some documented instances, small creatures that fall into the river do not survive the exposure. These observations reinforce the reality of the river's temperature, while offering no additional clarity regarding its origin. The boiling river of Shanai Timpishka exists in plain view, measurable and observable, yet resistant to complete explanation. Its hararat is not hidden beneath layers of earth, or inferred through indirect data, but present at the surface, where it can be seen, touched, and recorded. This visibility only deepens the mystery, as it removes the barrier of access while leaving the central question unresolved. The river behaves in a way that aligns with known physical laws in isolation, yet defies the conditions required for those laws to produce such an outcome in this specific location. The water continues to reach near boiling temperatures in a place where no clear source of such heat has ever been found. The metallic spheres of the rainforest. Deep within isolated sections of the Amazon rainforest, unusual objects have been found resting in silence beneath layers of vegetation and soil. These regions are often difficult to access, where dense canopy cover limits visibility even at close range, and the ground itself shifts slowly under constant biological decay. In such environments, discoveries are rarely immediate or straightforward, and anything that emerges from the Earth tends to be fragmented, eroded, or shaped by unmistakable natural forces. Yet in a handful of recorded cases, what was uncovered did not resemble anything expected from either geology or biology, but instead appeared as something deliberately formed and entirely out of place within the surrounding landscape. The rainforest, which normally absorbs and obscures almost everything introduced into it, seemed to have preserved these objects in a way that felt unusually resistant to time. Among the scattered discoveries reported from remote terrain, perfectly rounded metallic spheres stand out due to their unnatural symmetry and material presence. These objects vary in size, with some small enough to fit within a human hand and others significantly larger, yet all share a consistent geometric precision that is rarely encountered in natural formations. Their surfaces are smooth, curved with uniform consistency, and in many instances appear to reflect light in a controlled and even manner, as though their shape was produced under conditions far removed from the irregular pressures of natural erosion. The presence of metal itself, preserved in environments known for high humidity and rapid oxidation, only deepens the uncertainty surrounding their origin. In a region where iron-rich materials typically degrade quickly, their condition appears unexpectedly stable in ways that defy simple environmental explanation. When first examined in detail, the metallic spheres of the rainforest revealed surfaces that reflected their surroundings in ways that did not resemble typical geological formations. In most natural metallic deposits, corrosion, pitting, and irregular crystallization would be expected after prolonged exposure to tropical conditions. However, several of these spheres appear to retain a structural integrity that defies such environmental degradation, raising questions about both their composition and the conditions under which they were formed. Scientific analysis, where available, has struggled to place them within a known category of mineral, alloy, or manufactured material, leaving their classification unresolved. Even microscopic examination has not produced a consistent narrative, as different samples exhibit subtle variations that resist standard categorization. In several documented instances, these objects appeared partially exposed through erosion or shifting ground, suggesting long periods of burial beneath the forest floor. The Amazon's constant cycle of rainfall, sediment movement, and organic accumulation typically obscures or breaks down foreign materials over time, yet the spheres have been observed in states that imply both endurance and preservation. Their emergence from the soil does not appear to follow any predictable geological process, and their positioning within the earth often lacks the contextual layering that would normally accompany either natural deposition or human activity. In some cases, surrounding soil layers show no clear disturbance pattern, as if the objects were not placed into the ground in a conventional sense but existed there in a way the surrounding environment simply adapted to. Unlike known archaeological artifacts from the Amazon basin, the metallic spheres do not correspond to any recognized cultural or technological tradition in the region. Indigenous material cultures across the Amazon are well documented in terms of pottery, stone tools, and organic constructions, yet nothing within that record aligns with the precision, composition, or geometry of these objects. This absence of cultural linkage creates a significant interpretive gap, as the spheres cannot easily be attributed to known historical societies or technological capabilities within the rainforest's documented past. Even speculative comparisons to later industrial materials or modern debris fail to account for their distribution and condition in remote, inaccessible locations. Attempts to analyze their composition have produced results that further complicate their classification within established scientific categories. In cases where testing has been conducted, findings have suggested metallic content, yet the specific combination of elements and structural behavior does not always align with conventional alloys or naturally occurring metallic formations. the uniformity of shape across different specimens introduces additional difficulty, as natural processes rarely produce consistent spherical geometry without external shaping forces. Some researchers have noted that even when oxidation is present, it appears uneven or inconsistent with expected tropical weathering patterns, adding another layer of uncertainty to their material history. Each analysis seems to resolve one question only to introduce several new ones. Across the limited number of recorded cases, the spatial distribution of the metallic spheres has offered no clear pattern that explains their placement or origin. Some have been found in complete isolation, while others appear in proximity to similar objects without forming recognizable arrangements or alignments. There is no consistent relationship to water sources, elevation, or known archaeological sites, and their presence does not appear to correlate with any identifiable environmental or geological markers. In certain instances, local accounts describe finding more than one sphere within a small area, yet even these clusters fail to form structures or configurations that suggest intentional design. The randomness of their distribution contrasts sharply with the precision of their construction, creating a contradiction that remains unresolved. Even after repeated study and comparison with known natural and human-made materials, the metallic spheres of the rainforest remain without a definitive explanation. Their existence challenges multiple fields simultaneously, including archaeology, geology, and materials science. Yet none have produced a conclusive model that accounts for all observed characteristics. The difficulty lies not only in identifying what they are made of, but also in understanding how such objects could persist in an environment that typically alters or destroys materials over time. Each layer of analysis removes certain possibilities while failing to establish a replacement, leaving the mystery intact and resistant to closure. The objects remain exactly where they were found, silent and perfectly formed, as though they were never meant to be explained at all, the Amazon's lost city of Zede. Across early accounts of Amazon exploration, reports of vast and complex inland settlements appeared long before any physical confirmation could be established. European chroniclers, missionaries, and later explorers moving through the basin often described encountering signs of structured habitation far deeper in the forest than expected, though these accounts were frequently dismissed due to the lack of consistent evidence and the overwhelming density of the rainforest itself. Over time, the Amazon came to be framed in scientific discourse as a landscape that resisted large-scale human development, reinforcing the belief that any early reports of urbanized interiors were likely exaggerations shaped by limited visibility and incomplete understanding of the region. In this framing, the rainforest was treated less as a cultural landscape and more as an ecological boundary that limited the rise of complexity. During the early 20th century, British explorer Percy Fawcett documented his belief that an advanced civilization once existed deep within the Amazon rainforest. His observations, drawn from earlier surveys, indigenous accounts, and his own expeditions, led him to propose the existence of a lost urban centre he referred to as Z. Fawcett's final expedition into the region in 1925 ended in disappearance, becoming one of the most enduring mysteries associated with Amazon exploration. While his interpretations were never verified, his records contributed to a persistent narrative that the rainforest may conceal remnants of complex societies beneath its dense and rapidly regenerating canopy. The absence of his final findings only intensified speculation, leaving his hypothesis suspended between exploration and legend. For much of modern archaeological history, the Amazon was interpreted as a region incapable of sustaining large, organized urban centers. This assumption was largely based on the nutrient-poor nature of many Amazonian soils, which appeared unsuitable for intensive agriculture required by dense populations. Combined with limited visible structural remains above ground, this led to the prevailing view that the rainforest supported only small mobile groups, rather than interconnected civilizations. The absence of easily identifiable ruins reinforced this perspective, shaping decades of archaeological interpretation that emphasized environmental limitation over cultural complexity. In this context, the idea of a lost city was treated more as a speculative metaphor than a plausible historical reality. Beneath this long-standing assumption, isolated discoveries began to challenge the idea that the rainforest had always been sparsely inhabited. As researchers expanded surveys into previously unexplored regions, subtle irregularities in terrain and soil composition began to suggest patterns inconsistent with purely natural formation. These findings did not immediately point to a single civilization or urban structure, but they introduced the possibility that human activity in the Amazon had been far more extensive and long-lasting than previously acknowledged, operating in ways that left limited above-ground traces. The rainforest, rather than erasing all human presence, may have instead concealed it beneath layers of ecological renewal. Among the most significant of these findings is the presence of terra preta, a man-made dark soil that indicates prolonged and deliberate landscape modification. This fertile soil, enriched with charcoal, organic waste and other materials, has been identified across multiple regions of the Amazon basin, often in areas that otherwise show little surface evidence of human occupation. Its formation suggests sustained environmental management practices capable of transforming otherwise infertile ground into agriculturally productive land. The widespread distribution of terra preta implies that human influence on the Amazon landscape was not isolated, but instead extended across large and interconnected regions over long periods of time. Some deposits are centuries or even millennia old, yet they remain chemically distinct from surrounding soils, preserving evidence of human intervention in a way that conventional archaeology only recently began to fully appreciate. With the advent of modern remote sensing technologies, previously invisible patterns beneath the Amazon canopy have begun to emerge with unexpected clarity. LiDAR scanning, in particular, has allowed researchers to penetrate dense vegetation cover and reveal subtle variations in elevation that were previously undetectable from the ground. In several surveyed areas, these scans have uncovered geometric formations such as rectangular outlines, raised platforms, and linear arrangements that suggest structured planning rather than random natural processes. While these features do not confirm the existence of a single unified city, they indicate that human organization within the basin may have been more complex than surface observations alone would suggest. The rainforest, rather than being empty of structure, appears to contain layered traces of coordinated land use that were simply hidden beneath centuries of growth. In several surveyed regions, geometric formations and structural anomalies suggest patterns of human organization that resist simple classification. Some of these features appear clustered in ways that imply coordination between sites, while others extend across distances that suggest broader regional networks rather than isolated settlements. The scale and distribution of these patterns have led some researchers to propose the existence of interconnected habitation zones, potentially forming part of a larger cultural landscape that has not yet been fully reconstructed. However, the absence of continuous structural remains makes it difficult to define clear boundaries or confirm a centralized urban core. What emerges instead is a fragmented geography of human presence, distributed across the forest in ways that do not conform neatly to conventional models of urban development. Additional archaeological work in select regions has also revealed evidence of engineered landscapes that extend beyond simple habitation sites. Modified waterways, elevated ground formations, and arranged earthworks suggest intentional shaping of terrain over extended periods of time. These modifications indicate not only settlement, but sustained interaction with the environment, where land itself was adjusted to support long-term occupation. Yet even with these findings, no singular configuration has been identified that fully corresponds to the idea of a lost city in the traditional sense. Instead, the evidence points toward a dispersed system of occupation that remains only partially understood. Despite decades of research and reinterpretation, the concept of the Amazon's lost city of Z continues to exist between historical possibility and unresolved mystery. No single discovery has confirmed the existence of a fully formed city matching early exploratory descriptions, yet the accumulation of fragmented evidence, soil modification, geometric earthworks, and historical testimony continues to prevent its complete dismissal. Instead, the idea persists in a suspended state, reinforced by partial data that suggests complexity without yielding a complete picture. Each new finding adds detail to the broader understanding of Amazonian history, while simultaneously deepening the uncertainty surrounding its full scope. The deeper the Amazon is studied, the more it seems to preserve traces of something that once may have been complete, yet still refuses to be fully revealed. The uncontacted tribes that vanish. Remote regions of the Amazon basin contain some of the least continuously observed human populations on Earth, where documentation remains intentionally limited and irregular. Unlike densely mapped environments where human movement can be tracked through infrastructure, settlements, and constant surveillance, these regions exist under conditions that make sustained observation extremely difficult, even with modern satellite and aerial technology. The dense canopy layer obscures ground-level activity almost completely, and the vast scale of the rainforest introduces natural blind spots that cannot be fully eliminated through periodic surveying. Within this context, the presence of uncontacted indigenous groups is not theoretical, but acknowledged through fragmented evidence, though the continuity of that evidence is often impossible to maintain over time. What defines these populations, at least from an external perspective, is not a stable record of existence, but a series of intermittent confirmations separated by long stretches of uncertainty. Official field records from protected indigenous territories often capture only brief instances of contact before further verification becomes impossible due to environmental and legal constraints. Agencies responsible for monitoring such regions, including national indigenous affairs institutions in South America, rely heavily on indirect observation methods such as satellite imagery, acoustic monitoring, and limited overflight documentation. However, these methods produce intermittent snapshots rather than continuous records, meaning that any identified presence represents a moment in time rather than a sustained observation. In many cases, once a group is recorded visually or indirectly, subsequent attempts to reconfirm their location yield no clear or repeatable evidence. The documentation remains archived, but the ability to extend that documentation forward in time often collapses under the weight of environmental complexity. During aerial reconnaissance missions conducted over dense canopy zones, fleeting signs of habitation have occasionally been detected without sustaining long-term visual confirmation. These signs may include clearings, smoke plumes, or temporary structures, yet their visibility is often transient, disappearing within days or weeks due to environmental regrowth or relocation. The rainforest's rapid ecological regeneration plays a significant role in this process, as vegetation can obscure human activity in extremely short timeframes. As a result, what is initially identified as a confirmed presence can quickly become untraceable, without indicating whether the population has moved, dispersed, or simply fallen outside observational range. Even when coordinates are logged, revisiting the same area can produce entirely different environmental readings, as if the landscape itself has absorbed the evidence. Several independently monitored areas have produced reports of uncontacted group sightings that cannot be consistently reproduced in later observational cycles. This pattern does not suggest absence of life, but rather a breakdown in the continuity of documentation. In some cases, previously recorded zones of human activity show no detectable indicators during follow-up surveys, even when conducted under similar environmental conditions. The lack of repeatable data introduces a fundamental limitation in how presence is defined within such regions, where visibility itself is dependent on timing, weather, canopy density, and the unpredictable movement of groups within vast and interconnected forest systems. What remains consistent is not the location of these groups, but the instability of confirming them across time. Anthropological frameworks addressing the Amazon frequently emphasize the challenge of understanding human movement patterns in environments that resist continuous tracking. Unlike more open ecosystems where migration routes or settlement patterns can be mapped with relative stability, the rainforest introduces variables that disrupt linear interpretation. River systems shift gradually, vegetation density fluctuates seasonally, and terrain accessibility changes with rainfall cycles. Within this dynamic environment, human groups may move in ways that leave minimal lasting trace, not because they are disappearing in a literal sense, but because the conditions required to observe them consistently do not persist. In this way, absence becomes difficult to distinguish from movement, and movement becomes difficult to distinguish from absence. Current conservation protocols restrict direct access to many uncontacted territories, resulting in observational gaps that limit longitudinal study of isolated communities. These restrictions are designed to protect both the ecological integrity of the rainforest and the safety of indigenous populations, particularly in cases where external contact could introduce disease or disruption. While these protections are essential, they also create an inherent limitation in scientific understanding, as sustained field verification is not always possible. As a result, Much of what is known about uncontacted tribes is derived from indirect indicators rather than continuous presence-based observation. The data exists, but it is inherently discontinuous, forming a record composed of interruptions rather than a seamless narrative. Overlapping indigenous land regions and protected ecological zones create a fragmented reporting structure in which evidence of human presence is often indirect and decentralized. Information may originate from separate agencies, local indigenous communities, or environmental monitoring systems, each contributing partial perspectives that do not always align into a single cohesive picture. This fragmentation means that understanding of uncontacted populations is built from overlapping layers of incomplete data, where certainty is replaced by probability, and continuity must often be inferred rather than confirmed. Even when multiple sources indicate presence, the absence of unified verification prevents the formation of a stable, long-term record. Long-term monitoring efforts have repeatedly encountered the same unresolved condition: confirmed human presence, followed by extended periods with no verifiable reappearance. This does not necessarily indicate disappearance in a literal or final sense, but it introduces a persistent gap in observational continuity that cannot be fully resolved through current methods. The rainforest, in this context, functions not as an empty space or a static environment, but as a shifting field of visibility where presence can be momentarily verified and then no longer traced with certainty, regardless of continued searching or technological advancement. Each cycle of observation begins with partial clarity and ends with unresolved absence, leaving the underlying reality unchanged but increasingly difficult to define. A community may be seen clearly in one moment of observation, yet the forest provides no assurance that the same presence can ever be confirmed again in the same place. The stone discs with unknown symbols, archaeological records compiled from isolated Amazon excavations, describe a small but persistent category of carved stone discs that resist cultural classification. These objects do not belong to a single excavation context or a unified discovery event, but instead appear sporadically across separate field recoveries conducted in remote regions of the basin. Each instance is documented in isolation, often without associated material culture that would normally allow clear attribution to a specific society or time period. In standard archaeological practice, artifacts are typically interpreted through surrounding context, yet in these cases the context is either minimal, degraded, or entirely absent, leaving only the objects themselves as the primary source of information. Repeated laboratory measurements of these discs consistently show uniform carving depth and precision, despite their recovery from unrelated geographic locations. The stone surfaces, while varying in composition depending on the site of origin, share a level of controlled workmanship that suggests deliberate and repeatable technique rather than incidental or natural formation. Microscopic analysis of incision lines indicates consistent pressure application and directional control during carving, which implies a level of intentionality that is difficult to reconcile with the absence of any identifiable cultural framework. Even when the raw materials differ, the engraved execution maintains a surprising degree of structural consistency across specimens. No known indigenous symbolic tradition from the Amazon basin has been found to share structural similarities with the engraved markings on these stone surfaces. The region contains a wide range of documented visual languages expressed through pottery, body ornamentation, woven textiles, and ritual carving, yet none of these systems exhibit direct correlation with the geometry or arrangement found on the discs. This absence is not simply a matter of incomplete matching, but of structural incompatibility, where the symbols do not appear to evolve from or relate to any known regional visual logic. As a result, the markings exist outside the established continuum of Amazonian symbolic development. Cross-regional iconographic reviews have so far failed to identify any developmental or stylistic link between the disc symbols and documented Amazonian visual systems. Researchers comparing motif structures across South America have noted that even abstract or highly stylized traditions retain traceable patterns of repetition and transformation over time. The disc engravings, however, do not conform to these patterns of evolution, instead presenting arrangements that resist segmentation into recognizable units. This lack of internal progression or variation complicates efforts to place the symbols within any developmental lineage of visual communication. Tool mark analysis indicates controlled and intentional engraving techniques, yet no matching inscription method has been confirmed within known archaeological toolkits of the region. The precision of the carving suggests the use of stable tools capable of maintaining consistent depth across curved stone surfaces, which itself implies a level of technical capability. However, no direct evidence links these tools to any documented technological tradition in the Amazon basin. The absence of identifiable tool signatures leaves open the question of whether the production method represents an unknown regional practice or an entirely separate technological lineage that has not been preserved in the archaeological record. Spatial mapping of recovered specimens reveals a distribution pattern that does not align with settlement structures, ritual complexes, or historically documented trade pathways. Some discs are found in deeply forested areas with no clear signs of sustained human occupation, while others appear in regions that show only minimal evidence of temporary activity. This irregular distribution makes it difficult to associate the objects with any known system of movement, exchange, or ceremonial placement. Unlike artifacts that typically cluster around cultural centres or follow environmental corridors, these discs appear without predictable spatial logic. Linguistic decoding models applied to the markings produce no transitional or partial matches, preventing even fragmentary reconstruction of symbolic intent. In standard undeciphered systems, partial patterns often allow researchers to identify repetition, grammatical structure, or directional reading sequences, even before full translation is possible. In the case of these stone discs, such transitional structures do not emerge, leaving no foothold for interpretive progression. The absence of recognizable segmentation or recurring symbol clusters prevents the application of conventional linguistic reconstruction methods, effectively isolating the system from known decoding frameworks. Interdisciplinary evaluations across archaeology and semiotic research consistently reach the same limitation, where physical structure can be observed but meaning cannot be accessed. The discs exist as complete and intact objects, with clearly intentional markings that indicate communicative or representational purpose, yet no interpretive pathway has been established to bridge form and meaning. This creates a condition in which observation is fully possible, but comprehension remains structurally blocked. Each analytical approach contributes additional detail about material properties or carving technique, but none succeed in reducing the distance between symbol and significance. In some cases, researchers have noted that the clarity of the engravings increases the paradox rather than resolves it, as greater visibility does not lead to greater understanding. High-resolution imaging reveals minute consistencies in line curvature and spatial alignment that suggest deliberate design logic, yet this logic does not correspond to any known cognitive or cultural system. The more precisely the discs are examined, the more defined the symbols become, and yet their meaning does not move closer to interpretation. Instead, clarity intensifies the separation between recognition and understanding. Unlike many Amazonian artifacts that can be partially contextualized through environmental association, the stone discs remain detached from any identifiable ecological or cultural framework. Their presence does not appear to correlate with soil modification, settlement density, or resource availability, which are often used as indirect indicators of human activity. This lack of environmental anchoring further isolates the discs from broader interpretive models, reinforcing their status as objects without situational reference points. They are neither clearly functional nor clearly ceremonial within any known framework. Attempts to reconstruct possible usage scenarios have also failed to produce a consistent explanatory model. While some hypotheses consider ritual function, and others suggest communicative or mnemonic purposes, none of these interpretations can account for the absence of correlating cultural evidence. Without supporting material context, these theories remain speculative and cannot be anchored to verifiable patterns observed in Amazonian archaeology. As a result, the discs remain resistant not only to translation, but to functional classification itself. Even within broader comparative archaeology beyond the Amazon basin, no closely matching artifacts have been identified that could provide interpretive analogues. Stone inscriptions in other ancient cultures typically exhibit at least partial structural resemblance to known systems of record-keeping or symbolic communication, but the Amazonian discs do not align with these broader typologies. This absence of external reference points removes one of the primary tools used in archaeological interpretation, leaving the symbols without comparative anchors. The longer these artifacts are studied, the more they appear to occupy a category defined not by what they are, but by what they are not. They are not clearly language, not clearly art in any recognised tradition, not clearly functional objects, and not clearly linked to any identifiable cultural sequence. This cumulative absence of classification does not diminish their presence, but instead reinforces their physical certainty against interpretive uncertainty. The carvings remain physically complete and visibly deliberate, yet they exist in a condition where interpretation itself appears structurally impossible. The singing trees phenomenon. Within catalogued archaeological surveys conducted across remote Amazon regions, a small number of carved stone discs have been recorded without a clear cultural or functional classification. These artifacts are not part of a single unified discovery event, but instead appear across separate field reports compiled over time, each instance adding detail without resolving their identity. Archaeological documentation describes them as circular stone forms bearing deliberate carvings, yet their purpose remains undefined even within structured classification systems that typically account for ritual objects, tools, or decorative items. In the broader context of Amazonian archaeology, where material culture is often fragmented and heavily influenced by organic decay, these objects stand out precisely because they resist categorization rather than because they conform to any known pattern. Their repeated appearance in isolated documentation suggests that they are not anomalies of recording, but consistent physical entities encountered under varying field conditions. During initial examination of these stone discs, researchers identified carefully carved circular forms bearing surface markings that did not resemble known decorative or utilitarian patterns. The carvings appear intentionally executed rather than naturally formed, suggesting deliberate human involvement in their creation. However, the arrangement of lines, curves, and intersecting shapes does not correspond to established symbolic systems documented within the region. In many cases, the symbols are engraved with a level of consistency that implies repeated technique, yet no consistent interpretive framework has been successfully applied to them. This creates a separation between craftsmanship, which is evident, and meaning, which remains entirely inaccessible. Even under magnified analysis, the structural logic of the markings resist reduction into recognizable linguistic units or repetitive iconographic motifs. Among documented artifacts recovered from isolated excavation sites, the stone discs stand out due to the presence of engraved symbols that resist alignment with any recognized writing system. Linguistic comparison with known indigenous scripts and proto-writing systems of South America has failed to produce meaningful correlation. The Amazon basin, while rich in oral traditions and symbolic communication forms, does not contain any recorded system that matches the structure of these engravings. As a result, the discs occupy a unique position within archaeological records. They are clearly communicative in form, yet entirely silent in interpretation. Their existence raises the possibility of a symbolic system that either remains undiscovered or does not fit within current linguistic frameworks. In either case, the symbols occupy a space outside translation rather than within it. In comparative analysis with known indigenous artistic and symbolic traditions of the Amazon basin, the markings on these stone discs show no identifiable continuity or derivation. Indigenous material culture in the region is well documented in terms of pottery, body ornamentation, textile patterns, and ceremonial carvings. Yet none of these traditions exhibit a direct visual or structural relationship to the symbols found on the discs. This absence of stylistic linkage is particularly significant, as cultural artifacts in the Amazon often show continuity through shared motifs and adaptive reinterpretation over time. The stone discs, however, appear disconnected from these established visual lineages, as though they belong to a separate and untraceable system of expression. Even where symbolic abstraction is common in regional art forms, the discs do not follow comparable compositional rules. Under material composition studies, the stone discs demonstrate varying geological origins, yet their carving precision remains consistent across all examined specimens. The stones themselves are sourced from different types of rock formations depending on the site of discovery, indicating that the raw materials were not limited to a single geological environment. Despite this variability, the engravings maintain a uniform level of depth and refinement, suggesting a controlled technique applied across multiple instances of production. This combination of material diversity and consistent workmanship introduces uncertainty about whether the discs were produced by a single group, multiple groups sharing a lost tradition, or something entirely outside the expected cultural framework of the region. Toolmark analysis has not yet revealed a definitive signature that could link the carvings to a specific technology or workshop tradition. Across multiple archaeological assessments, the distribution of these carved discs shows no confirmed association with settlement sites, ritual centres, or known trade routes. Some have been found in isolated forested areas far from any documented habitation, while others appear in regions that show minimal evidence of sustained human occupation. This irregular distribution complicates efforts to contextualize their function, as most known artifact types in the Amazon are typically linked to identifiable cultural or environmental settings. The absence of spatial correlation suggests that the discs do not follow predictable patterns of use, exchange, or deposition, leaving their placement as ambiguous as their meaning. In several instances, reported discovery contexts include disturbed soil layers, but without accompanying artifacts that would normally define a broader cultural assemblage. Within linguistic and symbolic research frameworks, the markings observed on the stone discs have failed to correspond to any documented system of communication or recorded visual language. Scholars analysing the symbols have compared them against a wide range of known writing systems, including logographic, syllabic, and proto-symbolic forms, yet no consistent parallels have emerged. The difficulty lies not only in translation, but in establishing whether the symbols represent language at all, or whether they function within an entirely different conceptual system. Without reference points for interpretation, the carvings remain structurally present but semantically inaccessible, existing outside the boundaries of known linguistic development. Even pattern frequency analysis, which often reveals hidden repetition in undeciphered systems, has not produced a stable reading structure. Despite continued interdisciplinary study, the stone discs with unknown symbols remain classified as artifacts without interpretive resolution or confirmed cultural attribution. Advances in imaging, material analysis, and comparative archaeology have refined understanding of their physical properties, yet none have produced a coherent explanation for their symbolic content. Each new layer of analysis narrows certain possibilities while failing to replace them with definitive answers, leaving the objects suspended in a state of interpretive uncertainty. The persistence of this unresolved status underscores a broader limitation in archaeological understanding when confronted with symbols that resist contextual anchoring. Rather than moving closer to interpretation, each methodological approach appears to reinforce the distance between observation and meaning. The carvings remain clearly visible on stone surfaces that have endured time, yet every attempt to read them leads back to the same absence of meaning. The Amazon's magnetic anomalies, compasses carried into certain remote stretches of the Amazon have, on occasion, displayed directional behaviour that diverges from expected magnetic alignment without visible environmental triggers. In normal conditions, magnetic instruments respond predictably to Earth's geomagnetic field, allowing orientation to remain stable even in complex terrain. Yet within specific zones of the rainforest, this stability appears intermittently compromised. These irregularities do not present as constant failures, but as brief, localized disruptions that emerge and dissipate without consistent external change. The phenomenon becomes more notable not because it is constant, but because it is inconsistent in ways that resist simple environmental explanation. Directional instruments used during isolated Amazon expeditions have occasionally shifted their readings in ways that remain difficult to reproduce under controlled retesting conditions. When the same equipment is later examined outside the field environment, it often returns to expected calibration, suggesting that the irregular behaviour is not inherent to the devices themselves. This distinction is important in field navigation studies, where instrument error must be separated from environmental influence. Yet in these Amazonian cases, the boundary between device reliability and external interference becomes unclear, as the anomalies do not consistently repeat under identical recorded conditions. Beneath dense canopy layers where satellite correction signals weaken, handheld navigation devices have intermittently produced inconsistent orientation outputs. The rainforest canopy in certain regions forms a thick, multi-layered barrier that limits both visual reference points and signal penetration from above, creating environments where navigation depends heavily on local magnetic and inertial readings. In these conditions, even small environmental variables can produce noticeable effects on directional stability. However, the irregularities observed in some Amazonian zones exceed what is typically expected from canopy interference alone, introducing uncertainty into how these disruptions should be interpreted. Repetition of travel through identical forest corridors has sometimes yielded different directional outcomes, despite unchanged environmental conditions. In controlled movement studies, repeated traversal of the same path is often used to verify consistency in navigation systems, yet within certain Amazon regions these repeated movements do not always produce identical orientation data. This inconsistency is not uniform across the basin, but appears confined to specific areas where the reliability of directional measurement seems to fluctuate over time. The inability to reproduce identical results under seemingly stable conditions introduces a layer of complexity that challenges straightforward mapping assumptions. Standard geomagnetic models account for known mineral deposits in the Amazon basin, yet localized irregularities in directional consistency still emerge in specific zones. Geological surveys confirm the presence of iron-rich soils and mineral variations across parts of the rainforest, which can influence compass behavior at a localized level. However, the scale and variability of the observed anomalies do not always align neatly with these known deposits. In some cases, areas with similar geological profiles produce different levels of navigational disruption, suggesting that additional factors may be contributing to the observed inconsistencies. Field navigation systems combining traditional compasses and electronic positioning tools have occasionally disagreed within the same physical location. Under normal circumstances, modern GPS-based systems and magnetic compasses can provide cross-verification, allowing navigators to correct for minor discrepancies. Yet in select Amazonian environments, these systems have been recorded as diverging simultaneously, each indicating different directional readings despite occupying the same spatial coordinates. This divergence does not indicate total system failure, but rather a partial breakdown in alignment between independent navigation methods. Adjacent rainforest regions with near-identical ecological and geological profiles have demonstrated noticeably different levels of navigational stability. This spatial inconsistency is particularly significant because it suggests that the anomalies are not simply a broad regional effect, but may be highly localized in nature. Two areas separated by relatively short distances can present entirely different navigation conditions, with one allowing stable directional readings and the other producing intermittent disturbances. This lack of continuity across similar environments complicates efforts to define the boundaries of the phenomenon. Even with modern satellite-assisted orientation tools, select Amazonian zones continue to produce intermittent disruptions in spatial consistency during movement tracking. Satellite systems are designed to reduce reliance on local magnetic conditions by providing external positional references, yet dense canopy coverage and atmospheric interference can still limit their effectiveness in certain regions. In these cases, the disruption is not absolute but partial, manifesting as temporary loss of precision or brief inconsistencies in positional alignment. The persistence of these irregularities, even with advanced technology, reinforces the difficulty of fully stabilizing navigation within these environments. Over extended observation periods, some expeditions have noted that directional instability does not always follow a clear temporal pattern, appearing at different times under similar conditions. This unpredictability suggests that the phenomenon may not be tied solely to static environmental features, but could involve dynamic or fluctuating factors that are not yet fully understood. The absence of a consistent triggering mechanism makes it difficult to isolate a single cause, leaving the behavior categorized as intermittent rather than systematic. In broader attempts to map these areas, cartographic records have occasionally required post-expedition correction due to inconsistencies in recorded directional data. While modern mapping technologies rely heavily on layered data verification, the presence of even minor directional inconsistencies can accumulate into larger positional distortions over distance. In regions where these anomalies occur, map accuracy becomes dependent not only on technological precision, but also on environmental stability, which in this case cannot be assumed to remain constant. Notwithstanding extensive monitoring and repeated field verification efforts, the Amazon's magnetic anomalies remain defined less by their intensity than by their irregularity and resistance to predictable modelling. the phenomenon does not conform neatly to a single explanatory framework, instead appearing as a patchwork of localized disruptions embedded within otherwise stable environmental conditions. Each new observation refines understanding of where and how the irregularities occur, but not why they persist in such inconsistent forms. A straight line drawn through the forest does not always return the same direction when traced again under the same sky. The giant underground caverns, subsurface mapping techniques applied to remote regions of the Amazon basin, have revealed extensive underground void systems extending far beyond previously estimated geological limits. These findings emerge not from a single expedition, but from a convergence of multiple geological surveys conducted over time using increasingly refined imaging methods. What appears beneath the rainforest floor is not a simple network of isolated cavities, but a layered and interconnected structure that challenges earlier assumptions about how deeply karst processes can shape tropical terrain. In regions where the surface shows relatively uniform forest cover, the subsurface tells a different story, one defined by absence of solid continuity and the presence of vast internal space. Deep geological imaging of limestone formations beneath the rainforest floor indicates interconnected cavern networks of a scale uncommon in most tropical karst environments. Limestone dissolution is a well-understood process in which slightly acidic water gradually erodes rock over long periods, forming caves, tunnels, and voids. However, in the Amazon basin, the extent of these underground systems appears to exceed typical expectations for comparable geological conditions. The scale of connectivity between chambers suggests long-term stability and structural complexity that is not always consistent with rapid tropical erosion cycles. These subsurface formations do not appear as isolated pockets, but as continuous systems extending across broad underground regions. Analysis of subterranean structural continuity shows passages and chambers that extend in directions not fully consistent with standard erosion-driven formation models. In conventional karst landscapes, cave systems tend to follow predictable pathways shaped by water flow, gravity, and rock composition. Yet in certain mapped sections beneath the Amazon, passage orientation and chamber alignment do not always conform to these expected directional constraints. Instead, some segments appear to shift in ways that require additional geological context to fully explain. While natural variability in erosion can account for irregular formations, the consistency of these deviations across multiple surveyed areas introduces interpretive uncertainty into standard formation models. High-resolution cave surveying data collected from limited expedition entries suggests abrupt variations in chamber geometry that do not always follow predictable dissolution patterns. Some chambers expand suddenly into large open spaces before narrowing again into confined passages without clear transitional gradients. These shifts in spatial scale occur within short distances, creating internal environments that alternate between expansive voids and restricted corridors. In typical karst systems, such transitions tend to follow gradual morphological changes, yet here the boundaries between structural forms appear more abrupt. This irregularity does not necessarily indicate artificial influence, but it does challenge assumptions about uniform geological progression. Within documented karst system studies, certain sections of these underground caverns display spatial regularity that requires further verification before classification as natural formation. Some mapped areas exhibit unusually consistent angular relationships between intersecting passages, which stands in contrast to the more organic variability expected in naturally formed cave systems. However, these observations remain limited to specific segments and have not been uniformly replicated across the broader network. Geological interpretation therefore remains cautious, recognizing that apparent regularity in isolated regions may result from localized structural conditions rather than system-wide patterns. Restricted access conditions caused by flooding cycles and unstable ground layers have limited the ability to conduct continuous exploration across the full extent of the cave systems. Seasonal water fluctuations in the Amazon basin can rapidly alter underground accessibility, filling passages with water or rendering them structurally unsafe for entry. As a result, many sections of the caverns remain unvisited, or only briefly observed during narrow windows of favourable conditions. This intermittent accessibility prevents sustained documentation and creates gaps in spatial understanding that cannot easily be resolved through surface-level or remote sensing alone. fragmented mapping outputs from separate exploratory teams reveal partial, non-overlapping segments of the same subterranean network without a unified structural reconstruction. Different expeditions operating under varying conditions and equipment limitations have produced cave maps that do not fully align when combined. Some mapped passages terminate abruptly where others show continuation, while certain chambers appear in one dataset but are absent in another. These inconsistencies do not necessarily indicate error, but rather reflect the difficulty of constructing a continuous model from incomplete and temporally separated observations. The result is a composite understanding built from fragments rather than a single coherent map. Advancements in subsurface imaging and sonar-based geological modelling still leave significant portions of the cavern systems without continuous spatial confirmation or complete mapped continuity. Even with improved technology capable of penetrating dense geological layers, certain regions resist full imaging resolution due to depth, water saturation, or structural complexity. These limitations do not invalidate the existence of the systems, but instead highlight the boundary between detectable structure and fully mapped space. As imaging precision increases, more of the caverns become visible, yet complete continuity remains elusive. In some surveyed zones, transitions between mapped and unmapped regions occur without clear geological boundary indicators. This creates a situation where known passages appear to extend into areas that cannot yet be confirmed with available technology. The absence of sharp demarcation between observed and unobserved space complicates efforts to define the true extent of the system. Rather than ending at a visible boundary, the mapped sections often dissolve into uncertainty, leaving continuation implied but unverified. Hydrological studies conducted in relation to these underground systems indicate that water movement plays a significant role in shaping internal structure. Yet the flow patterns do not always correspond neatly with mapped passage geometry. In some cases, water appears to move through pathways that have not been fully documented, suggesting the presence of additional interconnected channels beyond those currently recorded. These inferred pathways further expand the conceptual scale of the system beyond what is physically confirmed, reinforcing the sense that observed data represents only a portion of a larger whole. The relationship between surface terrain and subsurface void distribution remains only partially understood. While surface features such as elevation changes and soil composition provide some indication of underlying structures, they do not consistently predict the full complexity of the cavern networks below. This disconnect between surface indicators and subsurface reality highlights the limitations of surface-based inference in fully capturing underground spatial systems of this scale. The rainforest above appears continuous and uniform, while below it, the ground resolves into fragmented and expansive internal architecture. Over repeated mapping cycles, certain cavern regions show persistent discrepancies in dimensional interpretation depending on the method used. Sonar-based reconstructions may suggest one configuration, while ground-penetrating radar indicates subtle variations in spatial arrangement. These differences do not necessarily contradict each other, but they do illustrate how dependent interpretation is on methodological perspective. The caverns remain structurally present in all datasets, yet their precise geometry shifts slightly depending on the observational lens applied. The cumulative result of all available data is not a complete underground map, but a layered approximation of a system that extends beyond current verification capacity. Each new survey adds detail, but also reveals additional gaps where continuity cannot yet be confirmed. The caverns beneath the Amazon exist not as a fully bounded structure, but as a partially assembled spatial reality that expands faster than it can be fully documented. The deeper the subterranean mapping extends, the more the cavern system appears to exist as a continuous space that resists complete spatial definition. The mysterious light orbs over the canopy. Nighttime visual recordings taken above dense Amazon canopy layers have intermittently captured luminous objects moving without a detectable physical source or emission origin. These recordings do not represent continuous observation, but rather isolated moments where unusual light behavior becomes visible against the otherwise uniform darkness of the forest canopy. In many cases, the phenomena appear briefly before fading or shifting beyond the field of view, leaving no sustained trace in subsequent frames. The consistency lies not in persistence but in recurrence, as similar luminous forms appear across different observation sessions under varying conditions. At varying elevations just above treetop level, observers have described small, silent light forms traversing forest space without producing measurable heat or sound signatures. In typical atmospheric light phenomena, luminous events are often accompanied by thermal signatures, sound propagation, or identifiable energy sources, yet these canopy-level observations lack such accompanying indicators. The movement is often described as smooth but irregular, with changes in direction that do not correspond to wind patterns or known aerial biological activity. This absence of secondary physical effects complicates attempts to situate the phenomenon within established environmental categories. Recorded accounts from canopy edge observation points describe luminous activity that appears briefly, then fades without leaving residual atmospheric disturbance. In natural light emission events, such as bioluminescence or gas-based illumination, there is often a measurable aftereffect or traceable environmental cause. However, in these Amazonian observations, the disappearance of the light is not accompanied by lingering environmental change, making it difficult to determine whether the source ceases, moves, or simply becomes undetectable. The result is a visual phenomenon that behaves as if it exists only within a narrow observational window. Across multiple independent nighttime field observations, similar glowing formations have been noted moving through forested airspace in non-linear and inconsistent trajectories. These trajectories do not follow predictable linear paths, nor do they conform to known aerial movement patterns associated with insects, birds, or atmospheric particles. Instead, the motion appears fluid yet irregular, with directional shifts that are difficult to correlate with external environmental factors. The repetition of similar movement descriptions across separate observations suggests a recurring pattern, even if the underlying cause remains unidentified. Standard atmospheric and optical models account for many forms of light reflection and emission, yet none fully replicate the reported behavior of these canopy-level phenomena. Known explanations such as light scattering through moisture, reflection from airborne particles, or distant bioluminescent sources provide partial frameworks for understanding unusual light appearances in forest environments. However, the specific combination of silent movement, lack of measurable emission source, and inconsistent trajectory does not fully align with these models. This leaves a gap between observable description and theoretical explanation. Field documentation using low-light imaging equipment has occasionally registered transient illumination patterns that do not correspond to identifiable natural or artificial sources. These recordings often show brief points or clusters of light that emerge within the frame without clear entry origin, then dissipate or shift beyond detection range. In some cases, the intensity and shape of the light change between frames in ways that do not match known camera artifact behavior. While imaging limitations in dense rainforest conditions are well understood, these anomalies persist even when equipment settings and environmental variables are adjusted for clarity. Separate observational records from different time periods describe comparable luminous motion above the rainforest, despite variations in environmental conditions and visibility quality. These accounts are not confined to a single location or season, suggesting that the phenomenon is not dependent on a specific climatic or atmospheric event. Instead, the similarity lies in the behavior of the lights themselves, which appear under different observational contexts, yet retain certain shared characteristics. This cross-temporal similarity introduces the possibility of a recurring phenomenon that is not yet fully understood in terms of environmental dependency. Even with extended visual monitoring technologies applied in tropical field studies, these luminous canopy-level phenomena remain without consistent classification or confirmed origin mechanism. Modern observational tools, including high-sensitivity optical sensors and stabilized imaging platforms, have improved the ability to detect low-light events in dense forest environments. However, the inconsistency of the phenomenon limits the ability to capture it in a controlled or repeatable manner. The result is a body of partial records that document appearance but not continuity, presence but not source. In some cases, the lights appear to interact with spatial layers of the forest in ways that suggest altitude consistency relative to the canopy surface. This perceived relationship between light position and canopy height remains difficult to verify due to limited depth perception in dense forest imaging. Yet repeated descriptions of similar vertical positioning suggest that the phenomenon is not entirely random in spatial distribution. Whether this indicates environmental interaction or observational coincidence remains unresolved. attempts to correlate the luminous activity with known biological sources, such as nocturnal insects or luminescent organisms, have not produced definitive alignment. While the Amazon basin contains a wide range of bioluminescent species, their light emissions are typically stationary or localized, rather than exhibiting sustained movement across open airspace. The observed canopy-level lights differ in both scale and motion behavior, making direct biological attribution uncertain under current evidence. Meteorological explanations involving atmospheric particles or electrical phenomena also provide limited partial overlap with some aspects of the observations, particularly in terms of transient visibility. However, these models struggle to account for the controlled directional movement described in multiple accounts. The combination of motion, silence, and lack of residual environmental impact places the phenomenon outside the most commonly accepted atmospheric categories. Over repeated observation cycles, the phenomenon maintains a consistent ambiguity. It is visible under certain conditions, absent under others, and never fully captured in a stable or reproducible form. This irregular visibility contributes to its classification challenge, as scientific documentation relies heavily on repeatability and measurable consistency. Without these elements, the lights remain observationally valid but analytically incomplete. Field researchers documenting nocturnal canopy conditions often note that the phenomenon appears more frequently during periods of low ambient disturbance, though this correlation is not strong enough to establish causation. Even in controlled observation environments where external light sources and environmental noise are minimized, the luminous activity does not present in a predictable or scheduled manner. Instead, its appearance remains intermittent, resisting attempts to define triggering conditions. The cumulative result of all recorded observations is not a coherent system of explanation, but a layered set of descriptions that converge on the same unresolved condition. The lights are consistently described yet inconsistently explained, forming a pattern of recognition without resolution. Each new observation refines detail, but does not reduce uncertainty, leaving the phenomenon suspended between documentation and interpretation. The lights continue to appear above the forest canopy in forms that can be seen clearly for moments at a time, yet never trace back to anything the forest is known to produce. The fossilized creatures that shouldn't exist there. At the core of the layered sedimentary record scattered across the Amazon basin, there are excavation sites that at first appear unremarkable, just another sequence of compressed earth and decaying organic matter slowly shaped by time and pressure. Yet in several of these locations, something begins to emerge that does not align with what the surrounding environment should reasonably contain. Fossil impressions appear where they should not, embedded in strata that suggest environmental conditions fundamentally different from those associated with the modern rainforest. The deeper researchers go into these layers, the more the ground seems to resist a clean interpretation, as if the sequence of time itself has been interrupted or rearranged in places that remain difficult to isolate. In regions where the Amazon rainforest is known to have stabilized into its current humid tropical ecosystem thousands of years ago, fossilized remains have been discovered that suggest the presence of species adapted to entirely different climates. Some of these remains resemble fauna typically associated with colder or drier environments, raising immediate questions about how such organisms could have been preserved in sediment that formed under conditions inconsistent with their biological needs. Paleontologists working in the basin rely heavily on stratigraphy and radiometric dating to construct timelines, and yet in these particular cases the expected alignment between environmental indicators and fossil identity begins to fracture in subtle but persistent ways. What complicates the matter further is the condition in which these fossils are found. In several documented instances across South American research publications, including geological surveys of the Western Amazon, the surrounding sediment shows little evidence of the displacement or reworking that would typically explain such anomalies. The layers remain relatively undisturbed, preserving clear boundaries between deposits that should correspond to distinct climatic eras. And yet within those boundaries, organisms appear that seem temporarily misplaced, as though they have been inserted into a record that was not originally designed to contain them. The inconsistency becomes more pronounced when these findings are compared with broader evolutionary models. The Amazon basin is generally understood to have undergone significant ecological transformation over millions of years, shifting from ancient river systems and seasonal wetlands into the dense rainforest environment that dominates today. Fossil records from other regions of South America often reflect this gradual transition, showing a continuity of adaptation and environmental change. In contrast, certain Amazonian sites present abrupt appearances of fully formed species without clear transitional evidence, a pattern that stands apart from the gradual sequences typically used to map evolutionary development. In some excavation zones, pollen analysis conducted alongside fossil recovery has revealed plant material that does not match the expected vegetation of the corresponding geological layer. This mismatch adds another layer of uncertainty, suggesting that both flora and fauna within the same strata may originate from environmental conditions that do not align with the established timeline. Scientists have considered the possibility of localized geological disturbances, such as river course shifts or sediment redeposition during extreme flood events, both of which are known to occur in the Amazon. However, even these explanations struggle to account for the consistency of the anomalies across multiple, geographically separated sites. Further complicating interpretation is the absence of intermediate forms that would normally bridge evolutionary gaps. In well-documented fossil sequences elsewhere in the world, gradual morphological changes can often be traced through successive layers. In these Amazonian deposits, however, such transitional evidence is largely missing, leaving isolated specimens that appear complete in form, yet disconnected from any visible lineage within the same stratigraphic record. This absence does not necessarily contradict evolution itself, but it does challenge the completeness of the environmental narrative preserved in these specific regions. Researchers approaching these sites often describe a recurring sense of discontinuity, not in the physical evidence alone, but in the structure of the record itself. The fossils are real, the layers are measurable, and the dating techniques remain consistent within accepted margins of error. Yet the combination of all these elements produces a result that resists straightforward explanation. It is this tension between data and interpretation that keeps these discoveries within scientific discussion, rather than allowing them to settle into established understanding. Across different field studies, there is also a pattern of repetition in the types of organisms discovered in these unexpected layers. Rather than isolated anomalies, they appear in clusters, suggesting that entire ecosystems may have existed under conditions that are no longer clearly represented in the surrounding geological framework. These clusters do not conform easily to known climatic reconstructions, and they appear in regions where no corresponding environmental shifts have been definitively identified. As research continues and new excavation sites are opened deeper within the basin, the number of these inconsistently placed fossils has not diminished. Instead, each season of fieldwork seems to add more fragments to a record that grows increasingly difficult to assemble into a coherent sequence. The Amazon, already known for its vast ecological complexity, begins to reveal something more elusive beneath its surface, something preserved not just in stone, but in a timeline that refuses to align. In the oldest undisturbed layers, where the sediment has remained untouched for millennia, the fossils appear as if they were never meant to be found together at all. The Amazon's blackwater illusions. At certain hours of the day, the blackwater rivers of the Amazon appear less like moving water and more like openings carved into the forest floor. Beneath the dense canopy, where sunlight reaches the river only in scattered fragments, the surface becomes so dark and reflective that it can seem almost detached from the landscape surrounding it. Trees rise along the banks in complete silence, while their reflections remain suspended below with unnatural precision, creating the impression of two forests existing simultaneously, one rooted in the earth and the other buried beneath the water. Long before researchers began studying the optical behaviour of these rivers, travellers moving through isolated parts of the basin described moments when the water no longer felt like part of the environment at all, but like a shifting boundary that distorted depth, distance, and orientation without warning. Unlike the sediment-heavy brown rivers that dominate much of the basin, Amazon blackwater systems contain remarkably little suspended material. Rivers such as the Rio Negro derive their dark coloration primarily from tannins released by decaying vegetation and organic acids filtered through rainforest soil over long periods of time. Because these waters carry low levels of sediment, light penetrates and reflects differently across the surface, especially under calm atmospheric conditions. Scientists studying the chemistry of blackwater rivers have documented their unusually high acidity and low nutrient content, conditions that support a very different ecological structure from the more turbulent whitewater systems elsewhere in the Amazon. Yet despite the scientific explanation for their coloration, the visual behaviour of these rivers remains difficult to fully predict once environmental conditions align in certain ways. What unsettles many researchers is not simply the darkness of the water, but the way it alters visual perception along the riverbanks. In narrow channels surrounded by dense vegetation, the reflections become so sharp that the dividing line between surface and depth can nearly disappear. Under still conditions, branches extending over the water duplicate themselves with near-perfect symmetry, making it difficult to distinguish where the forest ends and the river begins. Researchers navigating these areas have described moments when spatial awareness becomes unreliable, particularly during early morning and late afternoon, when low-angle sunlight intensifies the mirror effect. Even experienced guides accustomed to travelling through blackwater systems sometimes pause to reorient themselves after entering particularly reflective stretches of river. During field observations conducted in narrow tributaries, depth and distance often become unexpectedly difficult to judge. Scientists documenting fish populations and aquatic movement in blackwater habitats have occasionally noted visual distortions that complicate navigation and observation, especially in regions where the water remains almost completely undisturbed by wind or current. Canoes moving through these channels can appear suspended between identical reflections of the canopy above and below, while shoreline features lose definition as the surface absorbs surrounding shadows. In certain lighting conditions, the water reflects sections of the forest with such clarity that researchers struggle to identify submerged obstacles until they are dangerously close. These effects are not constant, which makes them even harder to study systematically. A river that appears visually stable one day may behave entirely differently the next, despite no measurable changes in water chemistry or weather patterns. Wildlife behaviour around some stretches of blackwater has added another layer of uncertainty to the phenomenon. Biologists studying Amazonian bird and insect activity have occasionally observed hesitation or altered movement patterns near highly reflective water surfaces. Certain dragonflies and aquatic birds appear to misjudge the position of the river during low-light conditions, briefly adjusting course as though reacting to a visual inconsistency. Fish species inhabiting blackwater systems also behave differently from those in sediment-rich rivers, relying more heavily on non-visual sensory mechanisms due to the limited penetration of light beneath the surface. In some isolated tributaries, even mammals approaching the water's edge have been observed pausing longer than expected before crossing or drinking, though researchers remain cautious about assigning meaning to these patterns. The behaviour itself is not fully understood, but it reinforces the broader impression that blackwater environments alter perception in subtle and measurable ways. Attempts to explain these distortions have largely focused on the unusual optical properties of tannin-rich water. Scientists have proposed that the near-black surface, combined with low sediment concentration and minimal turbulence, creates highly efficient reflective conditions capable of producing extreme visual symmetry. Humidity, canopy density, and solar angle also influence how the surface behaves, especially in remote channels shielded from strong winds. Yet even with these explanations, certain field observations remain difficult to reproduce consistently in controlled studies. Researchers can explain why the rivers appear dark, why reflections become unusually sharp, and why depth perception may occasionally become unreliable. But these explanations do not fully account for the intensity of the disorientation reported in some areas of the Amazon's blackwater networks. Far deeper into the rainforest, where the canopy tightens around isolated channels, the reflections become increasingly difficult to separate from the world above them. In these remote sections, the rivers narrow into corridors of nearly motionless water, where the surrounding jungle appears doubled with unnerving precision. The silence of these places intensifies the effect. Without visible current or sound to confirm movement, travellers can lose all immediate reference points except the canoe beneath them and the mirrored forest extending endlessly in both directions. Researchers working in isolated blackwater regions have noted how quickly the environment begins to distort ordinary perception once visual depth disappears. The sensation is not dramatic or sudden, but gradual, building slowly as the river absorbs more light and the reflected canopy becomes indistinguishable from the real one overhead. In some regions of the Amazon's blackwater networks, travellers have described the unsettling sensation of drifting through a landscape without a visible horizon. Sky, water, and forest blend into a single uninterrupted image, where orientation depends entirely on memory and instinct, rather than clear visual markers. The deeper these rivers extend into untouched rainforest, the stronger the effect appears to become, particularly during periods of low light when reflections remain perfectly intact across the surface. Scientists continue to study the chemistry and optics of blackwater systems, but the experience of moving through them still resists complete explanation, leaving behind accounts that sound less like scientific observations and more like descriptions of a landscape temporarily detached from ordinary perception. Some stretches of the Blackwater rivers remain so unnaturally still that the reflected forest appears more stable than the jungle itself, the ancient terra preta soil. Under large sections of the Amazon rainforest, the ground changes in ways that should not naturally occur in such a wet and heavily weathered environment. Across much of the basin, tropical rainfall strips nutrients from the soil with relentless efficiency, leaving behind earth that is often thin, acidic, and difficult to cultivate for long periods of time. For centuries, this harsh ecological limitation shaped assumptions about the Amazon itself. The rainforest was seen as vast and biologically rich, but fundamentally incapable of supporting large and complex human populations over extended periods. Yet hidden beneath dense vegetation and layers of roots, scattered patches of unusually dark earth began to challenge that belief. These isolated zones appeared richer, deeper, and far more fertile than the surrounding soil, as though parts of the forest floor had been deliberately altered long before modern science ever arrived to study them. Known today as terra preta, these unusually dark and fertile soils have become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the Amazon basin. The term, which translates from Portuguese as black earth, refers to human-made soil enriched with charcoal, organic waste, bone fragments, and broken pottery accumulated over generations. Unlike ordinary Amazonian soil, terra preta contains high levels of carbon and nutrients such as phosphorus and calcium, allowing it to retain fertility for centuries. Scientific analysis has confirmed that these deposits were intentionally engineered rather than naturally formed, with many dating back hundreds or even thousands of years before European contact with South America. The discovery fundamentally altered long-standing assumptions about how ancient populations interacted with the rainforest environment. Scattered across multiple regions of the rainforest, terra preta deposits appear far too widespread to represent isolated human activity. Archaeologists have uncovered these fertile soils near rivers, deep within forested interiors, and around ancient habitation zones spread across vast sections of the Amazon basin. Some deposits cover only small clearings, while others extend across several hectares, suggesting organised and sustained land management on a scale once considered impossible in the region. The consistency of the soil composition across distant locations also implies that the knowledge required to create terra preta was not accidental or localised, but shared across communities that may have been interconnected through trade, migration, or cultural exchange. For much of modern scientific history, the Amazon was believed to be incapable of sustaining dense, long-term civilizations on a large scale. Early theories described the rainforest as an ecological barrier where poor soil prevented the development of complex agricultural societies comparable to those found in other parts of the world. Terra preta directly contradicts that assumption. The existence of these engineered soils suggests that ancient populations not only adapted to the rainforest, but learned how to permanently transform its most limiting environmental feature. The implications reach far beyond agriculture alone. If the Amazon contained extensive areas of artificially enhanced soil, then it may also have supported settlements and population networks far larger than earlier historians believed possible. Embedded within many terra preta sites are fragments of pottery, burned organic matter, animal bones, and layers of charcoal deliberately mixed into the earth. Researchers believe ancient inhabitants produced this charcoal through controlled low-temperature burning, creating what is now commonly referred to as biochar. Unlike ordinary ash, biochar remains stable in soil for extremely long periods of time and improves nutrient retention by supporting microbial activity. What continues to puzzle scientists is not simply that ancient Amazonians discovered this technique, but that the resulting soil behaves with an efficiency modern agriculture still struggles to fully reproduce. Even centuries after the original communities disappeared, terra preta remains fertile, while surrounding soils degrade rapidly under the same environmental conditions. Modern agricultural researchers have spent decades trying to understand why ancient Terra Preta soil remains productive long after surrounding ground has been exhausted. Experiments attempting to recreate its structure have achieved partial success, but the original Amazonian deposits continue to outperform many modern equivalents in both nutrient retention and microbial diversity. The soil appears to function as a self-sustaining ecosystem, where microorganisms, fungi, and organic compounds interact in unusually stable ways. Some scientists believe Terra Preta supports microbial communities so specialized that they continue regenerating fertility long after the original human intervention ceased. This regenerative quality remains one of the most difficult aspects of the soil to explain completely. Around several Terra Preta regions, clusters of useful tree species appear in patterns that some scientists believe may not be entirely natural. Fruit-bearing trees, medicinal plants, and other economically valuable species are often concentrated near areas of ancient human activity, suggesting portions of the rainforest may have been deliberately cultivated over generations. This possibility has reshaped how researchers interpret the Amazon itself. Rather than viewing the rainforest as untouched wilderness, some archaeologists and ecologists now argue that large sections of it were influenced, managed, or partially engineered by human populations long before European arrival. The forest canopy that appears wild today may contain the surviving ecological footprint of societies whose structures vanished while their environmental systems endured. As more sections of the rainforest are surveyed through archaeology and satellite mapping, the scale of these engineered soils continues to expand beyond earlier expectations. New Terra Preta sites are still being discovered, sometimes in regions previously assumed to have supported only sparse human habitation. At the same time, evidence of geometric earthworks, ancient settlements, and managed forest zones has begun appearing near some of these fertile deposits, hinting at social complexity that remains only partially understood. Yet despite these discoveries, no complete picture of the civilization or civilizations responsible for Terra Preta has emerged. Their agricultural knowledge survived in the soil itself, but much of their identity disappeared beneath centuries of forest growth. The deeper researchers look beneath the Amazon, the more the forest begins to resemble the surviving outline of a civilization that never completely disappeared. The disappearing lakes of the rainforest. Long after floodwaters retreat from certain parts of the Amazon, wide depressions in the rainforest remain marked by signs of recently vanished lakes. In these places, the forest floor often carries subtle evidence that large bodies of water were present not long before, with flattened vegetation, softened soil layers, and irregular shorelines etched into the landscape. The Amazon basin is known for its extreme hydrological variability, where seasonal rains and overflowing rivers regularly reshape vast areas of lowland forest. Yet among these predictable cycles of flooding and drainage, there are locations where water appears to behave in ways that do not fully align with established seasonal patterns, leaving behind landscapes that feel temporarily suspended between states. Referred to by hydrologists as seasonal or transient lakes, these bodies of water form throughout the Amazon basin under conditions tied to flooding, rainfall, and shifting river systems. During periods of heavy precipitation, water spreads across low-lying terrain, filling natural depressions and floodplains that can remain submerged for months at a time. The Amazon River system itself, along with its countless tributaries, is one of the most dynamic hydrological networks on Earth, and seasonal expansion of water across the forest floor is a well-documented phenomenon. However, certain lakes in remote regions of the basin do not follow consistent timing or duration, appearing rapidly in areas that may have remained dry for extended periods, then retreating without a clear pattern that aligns with nearby river behavior. Across the lowland floodplains of the rainforest, rivers continuously reshape the terrain through erosion, sediment movement, and changing channels. The Amazon's waterways are in constant flux, carving new paths through soft sediment, while abandoning older routes that gradually transform into isolated lakes known as oxbow formations. These natural processes are responsible for much of the region's complex water geography, and they account for the presence of numerous lakes that exist in varying stages of life and decay. Yet within this already unstable system, there are documented cases where lakes appear in areas that do not correspond cleanly to known river migration paths or predictable floodplain depressions, raising questions about additional environmental factors that may be influencing their formation. What makes some of the Amazon's disappearing lakes difficult to explain is the irregularity of their behaviour from one season to the next. In certain monitored regions, bodies of water have been observed to persist for extended periods before draining or vanishing in ways that are not immediately consistent with evaporation rates, surface runoff, or visible drainage channels. Hydrological models of the Amazon basin account for immense variability, but they rely on measurable inputs such as rainfall, river discharge, and terrain gradient. When lakes appear or disappear outside expected correlations with these variables, the result is not a breakdown of the model itself, but a set of localized anomalies that remain difficult to fully reconcile with surrounding environmental data. Satellite imagery collected over remote regions of the basin has repeatedly captured lakes appearing and vanishing in locations that do not always follow expected hydrological patterns. Over time, comparison of orbital data reveals instances where water bodies seem to emerge between observation cycles, occupying depressions that previously showed only forest or dry ground. In other cases, lakes visible in one season are absent in subsequent imagery, without clear evidence of gradual recession. While cloud cover, seasonal lighting, and imaging resolution can complicate interpretation, repeated observations across different time periods suggest that some of these changes cannot be attributed solely to observational gaps. The result is a mapped landscape that appears to shift in subtle but persistent ways, even when monitored over long durations. Surrounding ecosystems often respond to these temporary lakes with remarkable speed, transforming isolated clearings into dense centres of biological activity. Fish populations may migrate into newly formed waters, while birds and amphibians quickly adapt to the sudden availability of aquatic habitat. Vegetation along the edges of these lakes can change rapidly, responding to shifts in soil saturation and nutrient availability. Yet when the lakes disappear, these same ecosystems undergo equally rapid contraction, with aquatic species retreating or perishing, and plant life reverting to previous forest conditions. This cycle of rapid ecological expansion and collapse highlights how closely biological systems in the Amazon are tied to unstable water patterns that can change within relatively short time spans. Far above the rainforest canopy, aerial surveys have revealed how unstable large sections of the Amazon landscape truly are over time. When viewed across extended periods, floodplain regions appear less like fixed terrain and more like shifting mosaics of water and forest that reorganize themselves with each seasonal cycle. In some areas, what appears as permanent forest on the ground may temporarily become wetland or open water during peak flooding, only to return to dense vegetation months later. These transitions are expected within a dynamic river system, but the speed and inconsistency of certain changes in lake formation continue to challenge simplified interpretations of hydrological stability in specific remote zones of the basin. Comparisons between historical maps, satellite records, and modern field observations continue to expose inconsistencies in how certain Amazon lakes evolve and disappear. Cartographic records compiled over decades sometimes show lakes that appear in one dataset but are missing in earlier or later versions, even when those datasets are separated by relatively short time intervals. In other cases, field researchers arriving at locations identified through satellite imagery have encountered dry depressions or forested terrain where open water was previously recorded. While part of this discrepancy can be attributed to the limitations of remote sensing in dense rainforest environments, the repeated nature of these inconsistencies across multiple regions suggests that some lakes may be more transient than traditional hydrological categories can easily describe. Entire lakes disappear beneath the rainforest, with so little trace that researchers are often left searching for water that satellite images confirmed only months earlier, the giant stone structures beneath vegetation. What first appeared as irregular breaks in the continuity of the forest canopy offered no indication of the vast structures hidden beneath it. From the ground level, the Amazon rainforest presents itself as an uninterrupted biological mass, where trees, vines, and root systems merge into a continuous surface that conceals almost every feature of the terrain below. For a long time, this visual uniformity shaped the assumption that the land itself was largely untouched at scale, with only small, scattered traces of human activity embedded within the overwhelming density of vegetation. Yet subtle irregularities in elevation, drainage patterns, and forest alignment began to suggest that something more structured might exist beneath the surface layer of growth. When LiDAR technology began scanning through dense vegetation, the results revealed something that traditional ground surveys had completely missed: light detection and ranging systems, which measure distance by reflecting laser pulses off the ground surface, have been increasingly used in tropical archaeology to penetrate forest canopies that are otherwise impenetrable to direct observation. In the Amazon basin, these scans produced unexpected maps of the terrain below the trees, revealing variations in elevation that did not match natural erosion patterns alone. What emerged from the filtered data was not random disruption, but structured form, as though the ground itself had been shaped with intention long before the forest reclaimed it. Once the canopy layer is digitally stripped away, the landscape below begins to form shapes that resemble deliberate planning rather than natural erosion. Linear embankments appear where no visible cause for sediment accumulation exists, while raised platforms and flattened areas emerge in configurations that suggest repeated structural logic. These formations do not present themselves as isolated anomalies, but as parts of larger arrangements that follow geometric principles such as alignment, symmetry, and repetition. In some cases, the spacing between features appears consistent across wide areas, reinforcing the impression that these were not accidental formations, but the result of coordinated modification of the landscape. In several documented regions, these geometric formations extend far beyond isolated patches, forming patterns that suggest organized spatial design. Archaeological surveys supported by remote sensing have identified networks of earthworks that include circular enclosures, rectangular outlines, and interconnected pathways carved into or raised above the natural terrain. While interpretations vary, the consistency of these shapes across multiple sites indicates that they are unlikely to be the result of natural geological processes alone. Instead, they point toward repeated application of design principles that governed how space was arranged and used over time, even in environments as dynamic and biologically active as the Amazon rainforest. Over centuries of uninterrupted growth, the rainforest has gradually concealed these formations under layers of roots, soil, and biological accumulation. The Amazon is not a static environment, but a constantly evolving system in which vegetation expands, decays, and regenerates in continuous cycles. As trees grow and fall, and as organic material accumulates on the forest floor, any underlying structures become increasingly obscured. What may once have been open clearings, embankments, or constructed platforms have been slowly absorbed into the ecological structure of the forest itself, leaving only faint traces that can no longer be perceived without technological intervention. As interpretations continue to emerge, researchers remain divided on whether these structures represent habitation zones, ceremonial spaces, or agricultural systems. Some models suggest that certain earthworks may have functioned as controlled environments for cultivation, where soil and water were managed in ways adapted to rainforest conditions. Others propose that the geometric layouts reflect social or cultural organization, possibly defining boundaries, gathering spaces, or interconnected settlements. However, without accompanying written records or fully preserved architectural remains, the precise function of these formations remains open to interpretation, constrained only by the physical evidence that survives beneath the forest. Across distant parts of the basin, repeating linear and rectangular configurations have been identified in distinct regions separated by vast stretches of rainforest. This repetition suggests that similar construction methods or design principles may have been used across areas that are not easily connected by modern geography alone. While environmental conditions across the Amazon vary, the recurrence of comparable structural patterns raises questions about how knowledge of land modification may have been shared, transmitted, or independently developed in parallel by groups adapting to similar ecological constraints. The presence of these patterns in multiple locations continues to challenge simplified assumptions about the historical use of the landscape. Each new survey adds another fragment to a pattern that grows harder to dismiss as coincidence alone. As more regions are examined using advanced imaging techniques, the number of identified earthworks continues to expand, revealing a landscape that contains far more structural complexity than was previously assumed. The Amazon rainforest, long viewed primarily through its ecological richness, begins to reveal a second layer of history embedded beneath its living surface. This hidden geometry does not replace the forest above it, but exists beneath it, preserved in forms that survive only through careful observation and technological reconstruction. The original geometry of these buried formations persists in silence, even as the rainforest above continues to reshape everything around it. The unknown signals recorded in the jungle, sound in dense rainforest environments rarely travels in a clean or predictable form, often breaking apart as it moves through layers of vegetation and humidity. In the Amazon, acoustic energy is constantly shaped by environmental density, where towering canopy structures, thick undergrowth, and persistent atmospheric moisture absorb and scatter sound waves in complex ways. This makes long-distance acoustic monitoring particularly challenging, as signals weaken, distort, or vanish entirely depending on temperature, rainfall, and vegetation thickness. For this reason, much of what is known about sound in tropical ecosystems comes from carefully placed recording equipment designed to isolate specific frequency ranges from overwhelming background noise. Long-term acoustic monitoring systems deployed in tropical environments have occasionally captured unusual low-frequency patterns that stand apart from typical environmental noise. These systems, often used in ecological studies to track wildlife movement or environmental change, are designed to detect infrasound and other subtle acoustic variations that fall below the threshold of human hearing. In most cases, recordings consist of predictable layers of insect activity, bird calls, rainfall impact, and distant river movement. However, within large datasets collected over extended periods, isolated anomalies have been identified in which persistent low-frequency signals appear without clear environmental correlation. These patterns do not behave like standard acoustic background noise, and their repetition across time has drawn attention from researchers analysing long-term soundscapes. Unlike recognizable biological or geological sources, these low-frequency signals do not match the acoustic signatures of known rainforest activity. Wildlife in the Amazon produces a wide range of identifiable sound patterns, from the rhythmic communication of insects to the complex calls of birds and mammals. River systems generate constant environmental noise through flow and turbulence, while rainfall produces distinct acoustic signatures depending on intensity and canopy coverage. The anomalous signals, however, do not align with any of these categories. They appear as sustained low-frequency oscillations that lack harmonic structure typical of animal communication, and do not match the transient noise patterns associated with environmental events such as storms or seismic shifts. In several separate monitoring zones, similar patterns have appeared under comparable environmental conditions, despite being far apart geographically. Acoustic recording stations placed in different regions of the Amazon basin have occasionally documented these low-frequency signals under similar humidity levels, atmospheric pressure ranges, and seasonal transitions. While the recordings are not continuous, their recurrence in multiple isolated datasets suggests that the phenomenon is not confined to a single localized disturbance. This spatial repetition has led researchers to compare data across stations in an effort to determine whether the signals represent a shared environmental source or an as yet unidentified pattern within the broader acoustic landscape of the rainforest. Scientists analysing these recordings have considered a range of possible explanations, including atmospheric distortion and distant seismic interference. Infrasound generated by volcanic activity, oceanic wave interactions, or large-scale weather systems is known to travel vast distances under certain conditions, sometimes registering in environments far from their origin. Similarly, microseismic activity can produce low-frequency vibrations that propagate through the Earth's crust and atmosphere. While these factors can account for some forms of low-frequency detection, they do not consistently explain the structure, timing, or recurrence of the specific signals recorded within the Amazon datasets. Each proposed explanation accounts for portions of the data, but none fully resolve the overall pattern. Even when equipment is recalibrated and field conditions are tightly controlled, the same anomalous frequencies continue to reappear in select recordings. Researchers working in remote installations have taken extensive measures to reduce the possibility of instrumental error, including redundant sensor arrays, cross-referenced recording systems, and environmental isolation techniques designed to filter out known interference. Despite these precautions, the signals persist in certain datasets, often appearing in similar frequency bands regardless of changes in equipment configuration. This persistence has led to careful re-examination of both hardware limitations and environmental variables, though no definitive source has yet been isolated. At certain times, the signals form irregular sequences that resist alignment with known ecological rhythms such as rainfall cycles or animal movement. Unlike predictable environmental patterns that follow daily or seasonal cycles, these acoustic anomalies appear sporadically, sometimes clustered within short time windows and at other times separated by long periods of complete absence. The irregularity makes statistical modelling difficult, as the signals do not consistently correlate with temperature shifts, precipitation levels, or known biological activity. This lack of temporal consistency has become one of the primary obstacles in identifying a reliable cause or mechanism behind the recordings. Across extended observation periods, the dataset begins to suggest the presence of a recurring acoustic pattern that does not fully correspond to any identified source. When viewed in aggregate, the signals form a subtle structure that emerges only through long-term comparison of isolated events. This has led some researchers to treat the phenomenon not as random noise, but as a potential pattern embedded within the broader acoustic environment of the rainforest. However, without a confirmed origin, the interpretation remains tentative, constrained by the limits of current environmental and acoustic modelling. The Amazon rainforest, already known for its biological and ecological complexity, continues to reveal layers of activity that extend beyond what can be directly observed. Sound, in this context, becomes another dimension of the environment that is still being mapped and understood, shaped by factors both visible and invisible within the forest system. As monitoring technology improves and datasets expand, more of these low-frequency anomalies may come into focus, but their origin remains separated from anything that can be confidently identified within the known structure of the ecosystem. Every confirmed recording still points to a signal that should not exist without something producing it. The Amazon's undocumented species with unusual traits. Within one of the most biologically diverse environments on Earth, the process of documenting life often reveals patterns that extend beyond familiar classification boundaries. The Amazon rainforest has long been recognized as a global center of biodiversity, where millions of species interact within tightly layered ecosystems shaped by constant ecological competition, adaptation, and survival. In most cases, biological documentation follows a structured path, where organisms are observed, recorded, and placed within established taxonomic systems based on shared traits and evolutionary relationships. Yet in certain remote regions of the basin, the sheer density of life and the difficulty of sustained observation have occasionally produced records that do not fit neatly into these frameworks, leaving gaps in classification that remain open to interpretation. Through decades of biological research in the Amazon basin, scientists have catalogued an extraordinary range of species across nearly every ecological niche, from canopy-dwelling insects to riverine fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The region has consistently expanded scientific understanding of tropical ecosystems. Many species have been documented only recently due to advances in remote fieldwork, genetic analysis, and long-term ecological monitoring. Despite this extensive cataloguing effort, the Amazon remains one of the least fully mapped biological systems on the planet, with new species still being described at a steady rate. This ongoing discovery process is expected in a region of such complexity, yet it also creates conditions where incomplete or partial observations can persist without immediate resolution. Among the vast number of documented organisms, certain field observations describe creatures that do not fully align with established taxonomic categories. These reports do not suggest entirely unknown life forms in a speculative sense, but rather organisms that have been observed with sufficient consistency to be recorded, yet not with enough clarity or completeness to be formally classified. In some cases, researchers encounter species whose combinations of traits do not match existing taxonomic definitions, requiring provisional categorization while further study is conducted. These instances remain rare within the broader dataset of Amazonian biodiversity, but they persist across different research periods and locations, drawing continued scientific attention. In remote observational records, some species have been noted displaying behavioral traits that deviate from expected ecological patterns within their respective groups. Behavioral ecology relies on the assumption that organisms within a taxonomic category will exhibit relatively consistent interactions with their environment, including feeding habits, movement patterns, and social organization. However, certain field reports from isolated Amazon regions describe organisms whose behaviours do not consistently match those expectations. These include unusual timing of activity, atypical environmental interactions, or unexpected avoidance and engagement patterns with surrounding species. While each observation is treated cautiously, the recurrence of such anomalies in different studies suggests that they are not easily dismissed as isolated errors in interpretation. Occasional morphological inconsistencies recorded in field studies have required researchers to reassess how certain organisms are categorized within broader biological systems. Morphology, the study of form and structure in living organisms, plays a central role in classification, particularly when genetic data is unavailable. In some Amazonian field cases, organisms have been documented with physical characteristics that combine traits typically associated with separate taxonomic groups. These combinations do not necessarily contradict evolutionary theory, but they do complicate straightforward classification, requiring additional genetic or longitudinal study. In environments where direct observation is limited, such cases remain open longer than usual within scientific review cycles. Field conditions in dense rainforest environments often limit the duration and clarity of direct observation, complicating the classification of newly encountered species. The Amazon's ecological density, combined with frequent rainfall, limited visibility and difficult terrain, makes continuous monitoring challenging even for experienced research teams. Many observations are brief, occurring during short windows of visibility or accessibility, before organisms move beyond detectable range. In some cases, researchers must rely on indirect evidence such as tracks, calls, or environmental traces rather than extended visual confirmation. These limitations are well understood within field biology, yet they inevitably contribute to incomplete datasets, particularly in regions that remain rarely visited or difficult to access. Across different regions of the Amazon, similar unusual traits have been reported in organisms that have not yet been conclusively identified as the same species. This repetition of characteristics across geographically separated observations introduces additional complexity into classification efforts. While some similarities may be coincidental or the result of convergent evolution, other cases suggest the possibility of broader distribution patterns that have not yet been fully mapped. Researchers comparing field notes across multiple expeditions occasionally identify overlapping descriptions that suggest shared traits among unidentified organisms, though without sufficient physical specimens or genetic confirmation, these connections remain tentative. Modern taxonomy continues to evolve as new biological data emerges, yet some Amazonian observations remain resistant to full classification. Advances in genetic sequencing, ecological modelling, and digital field documentation have significantly improved the accuracy and speed of species identification. However, the classification system itself depends on the availability of complete and verifiable data, which is not always possible in remote rainforest environments. As a result, certain organisms remain in provisional categories for extended periods, awaiting additional evidence that may or may not be obtainable given environmental and logistical constraints. This creates a space within scientific record-keeping where observation exists, but final classification does not. Certain living organisms in the Amazon are still observed in the field without a complete scientific framework that fully explains what they are. The sudden sinkholes of the rainforest floor. At first glance, the rainforest floor presents itself as an unbroken surface of roots, soil, and decaying vegetation that appears stable despite the constant environmental pressure above it. The Amazon is often described in terms of its canopy and river systems, yet the ground itself is an equally complex structure shaped by centuries of biological accumulation, rainfall saturation, and slow geological change. From a surface perspective, it can seem deceptively uniform, a continuous layer of organic matter that masks the deeper interactions occurring beneath it. In many locations, even light pressure on the soil reveals just how layered and reactive this surface truly is, yet it still gives the impression of stability until that stability is abruptly disrupted. In many regions of the world, sinkholes are known to form when underground cavities collapse due to erosion, groundwater movement, or structural weakening of subsurface layers. These processes are well documented in karst landscapes, where limestone or other soluble rock formations gradually dissolve under the influence of water, creating hidden voids that eventually fail under surface weight. Similar mechanisms can also occur in areas with extensive underground water flow or soil instability, where gradual erosion removes support from above. While sinkholes are not rare geological phenomena globally, their behaviour in different environments varies significantly depending on soil composition, hydrology, and underlying rock structure. Within certain parts of the Amazon basin, isolated reports describe sudden collapses of forest ground that occur without clear warning or extended surface disturbance. These events are not part of a continuous or easily predictable pattern, but rather appear as abrupt failures in localized areas where the ground gives way rapidly. Field observations describe sections of forest floor disappearing almost instantaneously, with trees, roots, and surface vegetation dropping into newly formed voids below. In remote regions where monitoring is limited, these occurrences are often documented after the fact, leaving only disrupted terrain and exposed vertical soil profiles as evidence that the collapse took place. Following these sudden collapses, sections of vegetation and topsoil are often displaced instantly, exposing vertical cuts of earth that reveal multiple hidden layers beneath the surface. These exposed profiles can display distinct stratification, where organic material, compacted soil, and sediment layers are visible in sharp contrast to the surrounding forest floor. In some cases, the structure of these layers suggests long-term accumulation processes that are not immediately visible from above, offering a cross-section of environmental history compressed into a single vertical exposure. The abrupt nature of the collapse leaves little transitional structure, making the exposed formation appear as if it has been suddenly carved into the landscape. Although heavy rainfall and constant water movement are defining features of the Amazon environment, not every recorded collapse aligns neatly with expected hydrological triggers. The region experiences some of the highest rainfall levels on Earth, and water continuously interacts with both surface and subsurface layers of soil. This interaction typically contributes to gradual erosion and sediment redistribution, rather than sudden structural failure. However, in certain recorded cases, sinkholes have appeared without clear correlation to recent precipitation events or visible surface saturation, raising questions about additional subsurface factors that may be influencing ground stability in localized areas. In some cases, proposed explanations include underground water flow, soil erosion, and organic decomposition, weakening structural integrity beneath the forest floor. The Amazon's subsurface environment is not uniform, and variations in soil density, root networks, and buried organic material can create uneven structural support beneath the surface. Water movement through underground channels may gradually remove supporting material, while decomposition of organic matter can alter soil cohesion over time. These processes, when combined, may contribute to localized instability, particularly in areas where subsurface conditions are already uneven or heavily saturated. However, these mechanisms do not always account for the abruptness or unpredictability of every observed collapse. Occurrences of these collapses are distributed across multiple regions of the basin, without a single consistent pattern that fully explains their timing or location. Reports of sudden ground failure have emerged from different ecological zones within the Amazon, including areas with varying rainfall intensity, soil composition, and vegetation density. This distribution suggests that multiple contributing factors may be involved, rather than a single underlying cause. The absence of a clear spatial or temporal pattern makes it difficult to predict where or when such events might occur, leaving each documented case as an isolated instance within a broader but incomplete dataset. Below the visible forest layer, evidence continues to suggest that ground stability may be influenced by shifting subsurface conditions not yet fully mapped or understood. The rainforest floor is not a static structure, but part of a dynamic system that includes soil layers, root networks, underground water channels, and decomposing organic material interacting over time. While surface observation provides only a limited view of this system, subsurface interactions remain largely hidden, making it difficult to fully reconstruct the processes that govern structural stability. As a result, certain areas may be more vulnerable to sudden change than their surface appearance suggests, even when no obvious warning signs are present. Massive sections of rainforest floor have been documented vanishing downward in seconds, leaving voids whose true depths remain unknown. The ancient road networks, hidden by the jungle. For centuries, the overwhelming density of the Amazon rainforest has concealed nearly all traces of a large-scale movement across its interior landscape. The region has long been characterized by its ecological impenetrability, where thick vegetation, seasonal flooding, and constantly shifting river systems create a surface that resists long-distance visibility. From ground level, the forest appears continuous and unbroken, giving little indication of any underlying order beyond the natural cycles of growth and decay. This perception shaped much of the historical understanding of the Amazon as a space where human settlement existed in small, isolated pockets, rather than across coordinated or connected networks. With the introduction of advanced satellite imaging techniques, subtle variations in terrain and vegetation began to reveal patterns previously invisible from the ground. Technologies such as high-resolution satellite mapping and LiDAR-based analysis have allowed researchers to observe slight changes in elevation, vegetation density, and soil composition across vast regions of forested land. These variations, when viewed collectively, sometimes form patterns that do not align with purely natural processes. Instead, they suggest underlying structures that influence how the landscape is shaped, even beneath layers of continuous forest growth that obscure direct observation. Once processed through remote sensing analysis, certain linear anomalies emerge that resemble continuous directional formations cutting across the forested terrain. These formations are not immediately visible at ground level, but they become apparent when data is filtered to remove canopy interference and highlight subtle changes in elevation or surface composition. In some cases, these lines appear too consistent to be explained solely by natural erosion or river activity. Their straightness, alignment, and repeated occurrence in different areas of the basin have led researchers to document them as features requiring further investigation rather than dismissing them as random terrain variation. Spanning distances that extend far beyond localized regions, some of these formations appear to link multiple areas of the Amazon basin into continuous routes. Rather than existing as isolated segments, certain linear features seem to connect across wide geographic expanses, suggesting a level of spatial continuity that is uncommon in naturally formed landscapes. These extended alignments raise questions about how such consistent directional patterns could persist across regions that are otherwise separated by dense forest, river systems, and varying ecological conditions. The scale of these connections introduces the possibility of coordinated landscape modification rather than isolated formation. From ground level, the same regions that reveal clear structural patterns from above often show no visible indication of pathways at all. The Amazon's vegetation grows in dense, overlapping layers that quickly obscure any surface-level traces of past human or environmental modification. Roots, fallen trees, and accumulated organic material continuously reshape the forest floor, making long-term surface features difficult to detect without aerial or subsurface analysis. This contrast between ground invisibility and aerial clarity creates a situation where large-scale spatial organization can exist without any obvious surface expression. Interpretations of these formations remain cautious, with researchers considering possibilities ranging from transportation routes to agricultural or territorial land modifications. Some hypotheses suggest that these linear features may represent ancient pathways used for movement between settlements, while others propose that they could reflect organized land management systems designed for cultivation or resource distribution. However, without definitive archaeological artifacts directly associated with these formations in all regions, conclusions remain tentative. The evidence supports structured modification of the landscape, but the exact purpose and function of these modifications are still under examination. Across multiple isolated sectors of the basin, similar linear features have been documented, suggesting repeated instances of structured landscape alteration. These patterns do not appear confined to a single cultural or environmental zone, but instead emerge in different parts of the Amazon separated by significant distances. The recurrence of similar geometric and directional characteristics across these regions introduces the possibility that shared methods of land organization were present in multiple communities or time periods. While the degree of connection between these areas remains unclear, the consistency of the patterns continues to attract scientific attention. Taken together, the growing body of spatial data suggests that the Amazon may preserve a far more interconnected historical landscape than previously recognized. As more regions are analyzed using advanced imaging techniques, the complexity of these hidden formations continues to expand, revealing a landscape that may have supported structured networks of movement and interaction on a larger scale than once assumed. This does not replace the ecological identity of the rainforest, but it adds another layer to its history, one that remains partially obscured beneath centuries of biological growth and environmental transformation. New sections of hidden pathways continue to appear in satellite analyses, as if the forest is still revealing what once lay beneath it. The persistent myth of an unknown energy source. Instruments designed for environmental measurement in extreme tropical conditions are constantly pushed to their operational limits by heat, moisture, and atmospheric instability that distort even calibrated readings. In the Amazon basin, scientific field equipment is expected to function within one of the most physically demanding environments on Earth, where dense vegetation restricts airflow, humidity saturates every surface, and rapid weather shifts can occur with little warning. Under these conditions, even standard measurements of temperature, magnetic variation, or signal transmission can fluctuate in ways that require constant recalibration and redundancy checks to maintain reliability. Field documentation over time includes scattered accounts, in which researchers describe unexpected localized disturbances affecting electronic systems and navigation tools. These reports do not originate from a single expedition or institution, but appear intermittently across different research efforts conducted in remote regions of the rainforest. While most fieldwork in the Amazon involves predictable environmental interference, such as signal attenuation or equipment drift caused by humidity, some recorded instances describe disruptions that occur suddenly and without clear environmental triggers. These events are noted cautiously in field logs, often recorded as anomalies requiring further verification rather than immediate interpretation. Reported cases typically involve short bursts of interference, unstable readings, or abrupt equipment disruption that cannot be immediately linked to obvious external causes. In some instances, communication devices experience brief signal loss, while navigation instruments show temporary inconsistencies in directional readings. Environmental sensors may register abrupt spikes or drops that do not correspond with observable changes in weather or terrain conditions. These episodes are generally brief, lasting seconds or minutes, and often resolve without intervention, but their irregularity makes them difficult to fully attribute to known environmental factors. Reliable measurement in dense rainforest environments remains difficult, as thick vegetation and persistent humidity continuously alter signal clarity and sensor accuracy. The Amazon canopy creates a complex physical barrier that affects electromagnetic propagation, acoustic transmission, and even satellite-based observation. Moisture in the air and on equipment surfaces can introduce subtle distortions in data collection, while biological activity in the environment contributes constant background noise across multiple sensing modalities. These combined factors make it challenging to isolate genuine anomalies from expected environmental interference, requiring extensive filtering and cross-referencing of data sources. Certain remote observation zones have produced repeated field notes describing similar interference events during otherwise routine environmental monitoring activities. These areas are often located far from established infrastructure, where long-term scientific stations or temporary field camps conduct periodic data collection. While the majority of measurements in these regions fall within expected environmental variation, specific time periods have produced clusters of irregular readings that stand out from surrounding datasets. The recurrence of similar descriptions across separate expeditions has led researchers to compare records in an attempt to determine whether these events share a common underlying cause. Scientific evaluation of these disturbances has led to proposed explanations involving electromagnetic variation, atmospheric ionization, and naturally occurring electrical activity in the environment. The Amazon is subject to frequent electrical storms and complex atmospheric dynamics that can influence local electromagnetic conditions. Variations in ionized particles within the atmosphere may also affect the behavior of sensitive instruments under certain conditions. In addition, natural electrical phenomena associated with tropical weather systems can introduce localized fluctuations that are difficult to distinguish from instrument error without extensive cross-validation across multiple sensor types. Some locations exhibit recurring anomalies under similar environmental conditions, while nearby regions under comparable conditions show no measurable irregularities at all. This inconsistency introduces additional complexity into the interpretation of the data, as it suggests that the observed effects may not be uniformly distributed across the landscape. In some cases, two monitoring sites separated by relatively short distances report entirely different instrument behavior under similar weather, humidity, and atmospheric pressure conditions. This lack of spatial consistency makes it difficult to isolate a single environmental driver responsible for the recorded disturbances. Current environmental models struggle to fully incorporate these inconsistencies into a single coherent explanation based on known atmospheric and geophysical behaviour. While existing frameworks account for a wide range of natural variability in tropical environments, the irregular distribution and intermittent nature of these interference events do not always align cleanly with established predictive models. As a result, these observations remain categorized as unresolved anomalies within broader environmental datasets, pending further investigation and additional long-term monitoring. Recorded field data from the Amazon continues to capture brief interference events with no confirmed source to explain them,